Welcome, Keeper of Justice, to a journey through the shadows of moral complexity, where the line between protector and destroyer blurs like twilight across the battlefields of conscience. Tonight, we shall explore the complete chronicles of Christopher Smith, the man who would become known as Peacemaker, a figure whose devotion to peace led him down paths darker than war itself. Let the gentle rhythm of heroic tragedy and the whisper of moral ambiguity carry you into restful slumber as we trace every thread of his story, from childhood trauma to cosmic purpose. Close your eyes, sentinel of dreams, and let this tale of violence in service of peace unfold like the pages of tomorrow's judgment, written in starlight and sorrow, in the shadowed annals of human corruption, where innocence withers beneath the weight of inherited sin and children are forced to carry burdens that should have died with their fathers. There exists no tale more harrowing than that of a boy who witnessed evil personified in the man he was taught to love above all others. This is the story of how monsters create monsters, how trauma cascades across generations like poison flowing through clear water, and how the seeds of a lifetime's violence can be planted in a single moment of ultimate betrayal. The man who would become Wolfgang Schmidt was born into the Austria of the early 20th century, a time when the old certainties of empire were crumbling, and new ideologies promised simple answers to complex questions about identity, purpose, and the proper ordering of human society. His family possessed wealth accumulated through generations of careful investment and shrewd business dealings in the armaments industry, a fortune built upon the fundamental truth that human conflict was as constant as the changing seasons and far more profitable than peace. Wolfgang's education was that of the privileged elite, conducted in institutions where intellectual sophistication masked moral emptiness, and where the pursuit of knowledge was divorced from any consideration of how that knowledge might be applied to the betterment of human existence. He mastered languages, studied philosophy and history, developed an appreciation for art and music that would serve him well in the salons of civilized society. Yet nowhere in his refined education did he encounter ideas that might have inoculated him against the seductive appeal of systematic hatred. The rise of the Nazi Party in neighboring Germany provided Wolfgang with something that his comfortable life had always lacked: a sense of purpose that transcended personal advancement and connected him to what appeared to be a historic movement toward a more perfectly ordered world. The party's message spoke to educated men like himself, who understood that civilization required difficult choices and strong leadership, who recognized that sentiment and compassion were luxuries that reality could not afford when survival itself hung in the balance. His initial involvement with the Nazi movement was characterized by the same intellectual approach that had marked all his previous endeavors: a careful analysis of political trends and power structures that led him to conclude that association with the ascending party represented both ideological alignment and practical necessity. The wealth and industrial connections that his family had accumulated over generations made him valuable to the party apparatus, while his education and social position provided him with access to circles where more refined forms of propaganda could be deployed. The transformation from political supporter to active participant in genocide was neither sudden nor dramatic, but rather the result of a gradual erosion of moral boundaries that occurred as Wolfgang became increasingly integrated into the party's power structure and operational hierarchy. Each step seemed logical and necessary when viewed in isolation. Yet collectively they formed a path that led inexorably toward the kind of evil that defies rational comprehension or moral justification. By 1944, Wolfgang Schmidt had achieved a position of significant authority within the SS, commanding respect from his superiors and absolute obedience from his subordinates, while overseeing operations that contributed to the systematic destruction of human lives on a scale that dwarfed the individual atrocities of previous eras. His assignment to the Schlosser concentration camp in Poland represented the culmination of his career within the Nazi hierarchy and the ultimate test of his commitment to the ideology he had embraced. The camp that Wolfgang commanded was not merely a place of imprisonment, but a carefully designed instrument of dehumanization and death, where human beings were processed with the same efficiency that characterized the most advanced industrial operations of the era. His role as commandant required him to oversee every aspect of this mechanized horror, from the arrival of transport trains filled with families torn from their homes to the final disposal of bodies in crematoriums that operated around the clock to handle the volume of his productivity. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Wolfgang to function in such an environment were complex and sophisticated, involving the compartmentalization of empathy, the rationalization of necessity, and the cultivation of a worldview that transformed victims into abstractions that could be manipulated without emotional consequence. He became expert at seeing patterns rather than individuals, statistics rather than stories, problems requiring solutions rather than human beings deserving of compassion and respect. Yet even as he perfected the machinery of mass murder and earned commendations from superiors who valued efficiency above all other considerations, Wolfgang maintained the outward appearance of a cultured gentleman whose interests in art, literature, and philosophy provided him with a refuge from the more sordid aspects of his professional responsibilities. This ability to exist simultaneously in two completely incompatible moral universes would later prove to be a trait that he passed on to his son, though in forms that he could never have anticipated or understood. The personal life that Wolfgang constructed during his years as a concentration camp commandant included a relationship with Elizabeth Lewis, an American writer who had come to Europe in pursuit of experiences that would inform her literary work and provide her with the kind of sophisticated cultural background that her middle-class American upbringing had not afforded. Her attraction to Wolfgang was based upon his apparent refinement and intellectual depth, qualities that seemed to promise the kind of meaningful connection that her previous relationships had failed to provide. Elizabeth's presence in Wolfgang's life served multiple purposes beyond simple companionship, providing him with a connection to a world that existed outside the immediate concerns of his military duties, while also serving as evidence that he remained fundamentally human, despite the nature of his professional activities. Their relationship allowed him to maintain the illusion that he was not merely a cog in a machine of destruction, but a complex individual whose capacity for love and tenderness coexisted with his ability to oversee systematic murder. The birth of their son Christopher in 1951 occurred during a period when Wolfgang's world was already beginning to collapse around him. Though he maintained the pretense of normalcy and domestic happiness, even as Allied forces closed in on the Nazi regime and evidence of his crimes began to surface in documents and testimonies that would eventually be used to prosecute war criminals. The child represented both hope for a future beyond the immediate concerns of survival and a terrible burden of inherited guilt that would shape his development in ways that neither parent could foresee. The early years of Christopher's life were spent in the rarefied atmosphere of wealth and privilege that Wolfgang's position and accumulated resources had made possible, surrounded by the artifacts of high culture and attended by servants whose discretion had been purchased along with their loyalty. His education at the Augustine Institute outside Vienna provided him with access to the finest instructors and educational resources available in post-war Europe. Yet this privileged upbringing was shadowed by the gradual revelation of his father's true nature and the mounting evidence of crimes that could not be hidden forever. The investigation that eventually exposed Wolfgang's role in the Holocaust was conducted with the methodical thoroughness that characterized the Allied effort to document Nazi war crimes and bring their perpetrators to justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming and irrefutable, consisting not merely of documentary proof of his command position but of testimony from survivors who had witnessed his personal involvement in the selection and murder of prisoners, his presence during the most horrific operations of the camp, his direct responsibility for innovations in killing technique that had increased the efficiency of the extermination process. The realization that arrest and prosecution were inevitable forced Wolfgang to confront the possibility of public exposure, imprisonment, and execution for crimes that he had committed in service of an ideology that now lay in ruins around him. The prospect of facing judgment for actions that he had undertaken in the belief that they served a higher purpose created a crisis of identity and purpose that his sophisticated intellect was unable to resolve through rational analysis or philosophical reflection. The decision to take his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions was presented to his family as a matter of honor and dignity, a final assertion of control over his own destiny in circumstances where all other forms of power had been stripped away. Yet the method and timing of his suicide revealed the depth of his psychological collapse and the extent to which his capacity for causing suffering extended even to those he claimed to love above all else. On Christopher's 5th birthday, as the child played with toys and anticipated the celebration that had been planned to mark this milestone in his young life, Wolfgang chose to end his own existence in a manner calculated to inflict maximum psychological trauma on the son he was abandoning, to face the consequences of a legacy he had never chosen. The gunshot that ended Wolfgang's life occurred in full view of the child, ensuring that this moment of ultimate betrayal would be seared into Christopher's memory with a clarity and intensity that no amount of time or distance could diminish. The psychological impact of witnessing his father's suicide was compounded by Christopher's inability to understand the context and implications of what he had seen, leaving him with images and emotions that his young mind could not process or integrate into any coherent understanding of reality. The loving father who had read him stories and taught him to appreciate beauty and excellence had transformed in an instant into something monstrous and incomprehensible, creating a fundamental rupture in Christopher's ability to trust in the stability of relationships or the reliability of appearances. Elizabeth's response to her husband's death was shaped by her growing awareness of the crimes he had committed and the terrible realization that she had shared her life and given birth to the child of a man whose actions represented the absolute negation of everything she had believed about human decency and moral possibility. The knowledge that she had been deceived so completely about the nature of the man she had loved forced her to question not only her own judgment, but her ability to protect her son from the psychological consequences of his father's legacy. The practical necessities of survival in the aftermath of Wolfgang's suicide required Elizabeth to make decisions quickly and decisively, despite her own emotional devastation and confusion about how to proceed. The wealth that Wolfgang had accumulated through his family's armaments, business, and his own criminal activities provided resources that could be used to create new identities and establish new lives far from the scenes of his crimes. Yet this financial security came with the knowledge that every dollar spent was tainted by its association with genocide and mass murder. The decision to flee to America represented both an escape from the immediate consequences of Wolfgang's exposure and an attempt to create a new beginning for herself and her traumatized son in a country that had not been directly touched by the European horror from which they were fleeing. The legal name change from Schmidt to Smith was intended to sever any obvious connection to Wolfgang's criminal legacy, while providing Christopher with an identity that would not immediately mark him as the son of a war criminal. Yet the psychological damage that had been inflicted upon Christopher during that terrible moment of witnessing his father's suicide could not be healed through changes of geography or legal documents, for it had become an integral part of his developing personality and would influence every relationship and decision for the remainder of his life. The trauma had created a fundamental split in his psyche, a division between the part of him that craved love and connection and the part that had learned to associate authority figures with betrayal and violence. The new life that Elizabeth attempted to construct for herself and Christopher in New England was built upon the foundation of silence and secrecy about their past, a conspiracy of forgetting that required constant vigilance to maintain and created an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety about discovery and exposure. Christopher's enrollment at the prestigious Wyman School represented an attempt to provide him with the kind of educational opportunities that would allow him to transcend his father's legacy, yet the wealth that paid for these privileges served as a constant reminder of the source of their resources. The behavioral problems that began to manifest themselves during Christopher's adolescence were interpreted by teachers and counselors as typical difficulties of adjustment and development. Yet they actually represented the surfacing of psychological patterns that had been established during that traumatic moment when he witnessed his father's suicide. The fights and bullying incidents that marked his school career were expressions of an anger and confusion that he could not articulate or understand, manifestations of a violence that had been planted within him, like a seed waiting for the proper conditions to germinate. The withdrawal and lack of interest that characterized Christopher's academic performance reflected not intellectual limitation, but psychological protection, a defense mechanism that allowed him to avoid emotional investment in relationships or activities that might lead to further betrayal and abandonment. His refusal to excel or to form meaningful connections with his peers was a strategy for avoiding the vulnerability that came with caring about outcomes that could be destroyed by forces beyond his control. Elizabeth's career as a writer in their new American home provided her with a means of processing her own trauma through creative expression, while also maintaining the respectable facade that protected them from unwanted attention or investigation. Yet, her literary work was haunted by themes of betrayal, guilt, and the impossibility of escaping the consequences of moral choices, reflecting her ongoing struggle to understand how she had been so completely deceived about Wolfgang's true nature and what responsibility she bore for the crimes committed by the man she had loved. The relationship between mother and son during these crucial formative years was complicated by Elizabeth's own psychological damage and her conflicted feelings about Christopher's resemblance to his father, both physical and temperamental. Her love for her child was genuine and profound, yet it was contaminated by her fear of what he might become and her guilt about the genetic and psychological inheritance she had been unable to prevent him from receiving. As Christopher reached the age of 18 and faced decisions about his future direction, the accumulated pressure of years of suppressed trauma and unresolved psychological conflict had created within him a powder keg of violence and rage that required only the proper trigger to explode into devastating expression. The military service that Elizabeth hoped might provide structure and discipline for her troubled son would instead become the catalyst for the full flowering of the evil that Wolfgang Schmidt had planted within his child through that final act of ultimate betrayal. On a 5-year-old's birthday, the ghost of Wolfgang Schmidt would prove to be more powerful in death than he had ever been in life, for his legacy lived on in the damaged psyche of the son, who had inherited not merely his wealth and intelligence, but also his capacity for rationalizing the most extreme forms of violence in service of abstract ideological principles. The transformation from traumatized child to the monster who would become Peacemaker had begun in that moment of witnessing paternal suicide, and no amount of love, therapy, or good intention would prove sufficient to prevent the inevitable culmination of psychological damage that had been too profound to heal and too fundamental to overcome. The boarding school corridors of the Wyman Academy echoed with the footsteps of privileged children who had never known, want, or witnessed true horror, their conversations filled with the trivial concerns of adolescence that seemed almost grotesquely innocent to a boy who carried within his memory the image of his father's brain splattered across expensive wallpaper. Christopher Smith moved through these hallowed halls like a ghost among the living, his silence mistaken for sullenness rather than recognized as the protective shell of someone who had learned that human connections inevitably led to betrayal and devastation. The academic excellence that his mother had hoped military structure might provide remained elusive, not because Christopher lacked intellectual capability, but because engagement with the world around him required an emotional investment that felt too dangerous to risk. His teachers noted his obvious intelligence alongside his apparent lack of motivation, creating psychological profiles that spoke of wasted potential and recommended counseling that could never address the fundamental fracture in his developing psyche. The violent incidents that began to punctuate Christopher's academic career were initially dismissed as typical adolescent testing of boundaries, yet they revealed patterns of behavior that spoke to something far darker than normal teenage rebellion. When smaller students were found beaten with a methodical thoroughness that suggested not momentary anger but calculated punishment, when arguments were settled with a level of brutality that shocked even hardened school administrators, the faculty began to recognize that they were dealing with something beyond their experience or training. The bullying that Christopher both perpetrated and attracted operated according to dynamics that reflected his deeply conflicted relationship with power and authority. He sought out victims who reminded him of his own vulnerability, while simultaneously provoking confrontations with stronger opponents who could inflict upon him the punishment that some part of his psyche believed he deserved for being the Ferg's son of a monster. These cycles of violence provided temporary relief from the psychological pressure that built within him like steam in a boiler, yet they also reinforced patterns of thinking that equated strength with the willingness to cause suffering. Elizabeth's attempts to address her son's behavioral problems through conventional therapeutic interventions met with limited success, hindered by Christopher's instinctive resistance to emotional vulnerability and her own inability to reveal the true source of his trauma without exposing their carefully constructed new identities. The therapists who worked with him noted his exceptional intelligence and his sophisticated understanding of psychological concepts, yet they could not penetrate the defensive barriers he had constructed around the core experiences that shaped his worldview. The recommendation for military service that emerged from multiple consultations with educational and psychological professionals was presented as a last resort for a troubled young man who seemed incapable of functioning within normal, civilian structures. The discipline and clear hierarchy of military life were expected to provide Christopher with the external controls that he appeared unable to develop internally, while the physical demands of training might offer constructive outlets for the aggressive impulses that had made him unsuitable for traditional academic environments. Elizabeth's agreement to this course of action was motivated by desperation rather than conviction, for she recognized that her son was becoming increasingly dangerous to himself and others, while showing no signs of improvement despite years of expensive therapy and educational intervention. The hope that military structure might succeed where other approaches had failed was perhaps naive, yet it represented her final attempt to save the boy from the man he seemed destined to become. The United States Army that Christopher Smith entered in 1969 was an institution transformed by the demands of an unpopular war that had already consumed thousands of young men and showed no signs of approaching resolution. The military machine that processed new recruits was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it according to specifications that prioritized obedience, aggression, and unit cohesion above the civilian values of individual conscience and moral reflection that might interfere with the performance of lethal duties. The basic training regimen that Christopher underwent was intended to transform soft civilians into hardened warriors through systematic application of physical stress, psychological pressure, and social conditioning that made military authority seem like the only reliable source of meaning and direction in an otherwise chaotic world. For most recruits, this process represented a temporary surrender of autonomy in service of acquiring skills and discipline that would serve them throughout their lives. Yet, for Christopher, it offered something far more seductive: permission to embrace the violence that he had been suppressing since childhood. The drill sergeants who supervised Christopher's transformation noted his exceptional physical capabilities and his apparent immunity to the psychological pressures that broke down other recruits. Yet they failed to recognize that his success in training reflected not strength, but pathology. Where other young men struggled to overcome their natural reluctance to inflict harm upon others, Christopher displayed an enthusiasm for weapons training and combat techniques that suggested he had found his natural element. Officer Candidate School represented the next phase of Christopher's military education, designed to develop leadership capabilities in individuals who had already demonstrated their mastery of basic military skills and their commitment to the institutional values of the armed forces. The curriculum included extensive study of military history, tactical theory, and command principles that were intended to prepare future officers for the complex moral and practical challenges of leading men in combat situations. Christopher's academic performance during officer training was exemplary, demonstrating his ability to absorb and synthesize complex information while displaying the kind of analytical thinking that marked successful military leaders. His understanding of tactical principles was particularly sophisticated, revealing an intuitive grasp of how violence could be applied systematically to achieve strategic objectives. Yet beneath this intellectual mastery lay emotional patterns that remained fundamentally unchanged by military discipline and training. The psychological evaluations that were conducted during officer training identified Christopher as possessing the kind of cool detachment under pressure that was considered ideal for combat leadership. Yet the evaluators failed to recognize that his apparent emotional stability actually reflected his disconnection from normal human empathy rather than his mastery of it. The qualities that made him seem like excellent officer material were the same traits that had allowed his father to oversee mass murder with bureaucratic efficiency. The commission as second lieutenant that Christopher received upon graduation represented the culmination of his transformation from troubled civilian to military professional. Yet it also marked the moment when society officially sanctioned his capacity for violence and placed lethal authority in hands that had been shaped by trauma he had never processed or resolved. The gold bars on his uniform collar carried with them the weight of command responsibility for the lives of the men who would serve under his leadership. Yet Christopher viewed this authority through the distorted lens of his psychological damage. The deployment to Vietnam that followed his commissioning placed Christopher in an environment where the normal constraints of civilized behavior were suspended in favor of the immediate necessities of survival and mission accomplishment. The jungle warfare that characterized American involvement in Southeast Asia created conditions where the boundaries between combatant and civilian, legitimate target and innocent bystander, necessary violence and war crime became blurred to the point of meaninglessness. The platoon that Christopher was assigned to lead consisted of young men who had been drafted from civilian life and thrust into a conflict that most of them barely understood. Their training focused on tactical procedures rather than the moral frameworks that might have helped them navigate the ethical complexities of guerrilla warfare. They looked to their lieutenant for guidance and leadership in situations where traditional military doctrine provided inadequate direction for distinguishing between appropriate and inappropriate uses of force. The psychological pressure of command in combat conditions served to amplify rather than control the violent impulses that Christopher had been carrying since childhood, providing him with official justification for actions that satisfied psychological needs that had nothing to do with military necessity. The authority structure of the military meant that his decisions were rarely questioned by subordinates who had been trained to obey orders without hesitation, while the chaos and confusion of combat made it difficult for superiors to monitor his actions closely enough to identify patterns of excessive brutality. The village that would become the site of Christopher's most horrific crime was suspected of providing support and shelter to Viet Cong forces operating in the region, intelligence that was based on reports from sources whose reliability and motivations were questionable at best. The mission parameters that Christopher received were deliberately vague, leaving considerable discretion to field commanders about how to proceed in gathering intelligence and neutralizing potential threats to American forces operating in the area. The approach that Christopher chose for dealing with this suspected enemy stronghold reflected both his tactical training and his psychological predisposition towards solutions that prioritized fear and intimidation over more subtle forms of persuasion. Rather than attempting to distinguish between combatants and civilians, or to gather intelligence through careful questioning and observation, he opted for a demonstration of overwhelming force that would send a clear message about the consequences of opposing American interests. The massacre that followed was not the result of momentary loss of control or the heat of battle, but rather the systematic execution of a plan that Christopher had developed based on his understanding of how terror could be used as a weapon to achieve strategic objectives. The methodical nature of the killing, the attention to detail in ensuring that no potential witnesses survived, the careful staging of the scene to maximize psychological impact on other villages in the region, all reflected the application of sophisticated thinking to the problem of how mass murder could serve military purposes. The men under Christopher's command participated in the atrocity with varying degrees of enthusiasm and resistance, some becoming active participants in the slaughter, while others followed orders with obvious reluctance and horror. Yet none possessed the moral courage or institutional support necessary to refuse participation in actions that they recognized as fundamentally wrong, their military training having conditioned them to obey lawful orders while providing inadequate guidance for situations where those orders clearly violated basic human decency. The psychological impact of the massacre on Christopher himself was complex and contradictory, combining satisfaction at having demonstrated his willingness to take decisive action with a deeper sense of connection to his father's legacy that he had never previously acknowledged or understood. For the first time since witnessing Wolfgang's suicide, he felt a sense of completion and purpose that seemed to justify all the pain and confusion of his earlier years. The aftermath of the village destruction initially seemed to validate Christopher's tactical judgment, as intelligence reports suggested that his demonstration of ruthless determination had indeed intimidated other potential enemy sympathizers in the region. The silence that followed the massacre was interpreted by military intelligence as evidence that the local population had received the intended message about the consequences of supporting insurgent activities. Yet the very thoroughness of Christopher's approach to eliminating witnesses would prove to be his tactical error, for the complete absence of survivors created a void in which rumors and speculation could flourish unchecked by factual testimony. The stories that began to circulate about what had occurred in the village took on increasingly horrific dimensions as they spread through both Vietnamese and American military networks, eventually attracting the attention of investigators who had been tasked with monitoring compliance with international laws of warfare. The investigation that ultimately exposed Christopher's crimes was conducted with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized his father's eventual prosecution for war crimes, revealing disturbing parallels between the two men that went far beyond simple genetic inheritance. The evidence against Christopher was overwhelming and irrefutable, consisting not merely of physical proof of the massacre, but of testimony from his own men, who had been promised immunity in exchange for truthful accounts of what had occurred under his command. The court-martial proceedings that followed Christopher's arrest represented a crisis for military leadership that extended far beyond the immediate question of his individual guilt or innocence. The systematic nature of his crimes and the apparent premeditation involved in their execution challenged comfortable assumptions about the effectiveness of military training and oversight in preventing such atrocities, while the psychological evaluations conducted during his trial revealed disturbing insights about the kind of individual who could thrive within military structures while harboring such destructive impulses. The defense strategy employed by Christopher's military lawyers attempted to present his actions as the understandable result of combat stress and inadequate guidance from superior officers, arguing that the conditions of guerrilla warfare made it virtually impossible for field commanders to make perfect moral judgments under extreme pressure. Yet, the methodical planning and execution of the massacre made it difficult to characterize his actions as momentary lapses in judgment rather than deliberate choices that reflected his fundamental character. The life sentence that Christopher received was unusual in its severity for military crimes committed during wartime, reflecting both the exceptional brutality of his actions and the military's need to demonstrate that such behavior would not be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances that might have contributed to its occurrence. The punishment was intended to serve as both retribution for the specific crimes committed and as a deterrent to other officers who might be tempted to exceed the bounds of legitimate military action. The federal prison where Christopher began serving his sentence was populated primarily by civilian criminals whose offenses, however serious, lacked the systematic and ideological dimensions that characterized his own crimes. His status as a court-martialed military officer marked him as different from other inmates, creating social dynamics that reflected broader cultural attitudes about military service and the special responsibilities that came with official authority to employ violence in service of national interests. The psychological adaptation that Christopher made to prison life was surprisingly smooth, suggesting that the structured environment and clear hierarchy of incarceration met psychological needs that civilian life had never adequately addressed. The routine and discipline of prison existence provided external controls that substituted for the internal moral compass that his traumatic childhood had damaged beyond repair, while the company of other violent criminals offered a social environment where his own capacity for brutality was neither unusual nor particularly disturbing. The irony that prison represented a form of psychological relief for someone whose entire life had been shaped by the trauma of witnessing violence was not lost on the mental health professionals who attempted to evaluate and treat Christopher during his incarceration. Yet their efforts to address the underlying psychological issues that had contributed to his crimes were hampered by his sophisticated ability to present himself as a model prisoner while concealing the depths of his psychological damage and his continued fascination with violence as a tool for achieving desired outcomes. The time that Christopher spent in federal prison might have represented an opportunity for genuine rehabilitation and psychological healing, if his case had been approached with adequate understanding of the complex trauma that had shaped his development and the sophisticated defense mechanisms he had constructed to avoid confronting the implications of his own actions. Instead, the institutional focus on punishment and deterrence meant that the underlying psychological issues that had made his crimes possible remained unaddressed and unresolved. The offer that would eventually lead to Christopher's release came not from humanitarian concerns about rehabilitation or justice, but from the pragmatic recognition that his particular combination of intelligence, military training, and psychological ruthlessness might serve useful purposes for intelligence agencies that operated in moral grey areas where conventional law enforcement was inadequate. The Pentagon officials who approached him with this opportunity were less interested in his redemption than in his potential utility as a weapon that could be directed against enemies of the state. The promise of freedom that accompanied this offer was seductive, not merely because it represented escape from physical confinement, but because it suggested that his capacity for violence might finally be channeled toward purposes that society would recognize as legitimate and valuable. The possibility of becoming a sanctioned killer rather than a condemned criminal appealed to psychological needs that conventional rehabilitation could never have addressed, offering him a way to embrace his true nature while serving what appeared to be higher moral purposes. The decision to accept the Pentagon's offer represented Christopher's final abandonment of any possibility for genuine moral development or psychological healing, choosing instead to double down on the path of violence that had defined his existence since the moment he witnessed his father's suicide. The program that awaited him would complete the transformation that had begun in childhood trauma and been accelerated by military training, creating the perfect synthesis of technological capability and moral emptiness that would eventually emerge as the entity known as Peacemaker. Yet, even as he prepared to leave prison and begin this new phase of his existence, Christopher carried within him the unresolved trauma and unprocessed guilt that had shaped every decision of his life, psychological wounds that no amount of official sanction or technological enhancement could heal. The ghost of Wolfgang Schmidt continued to whisper in his son's mind, guiding him toward a destiny that would make his own war crimes seem almost quaint by comparison. As the boy who had witnessed ultimate betrayal prepared to become the man who would betray the very concept of peace itself, the corridors of the Pentagon in 1973 hummed with the quiet efficiency of an empire at war with itself, where the machinery of democracy ground against the gears of necessity and produced compromises that satisfied no one while serving purposes that could never be publicly acknowledged. In the deepest levels of this concrete labyrinth, far from the ceremonial spaces where politicians posed for photographs and generals briefed reporters on sanitized versions of military operations, existed programs that operated according to principles that bore no resemblance to the constitutional ideals carved in marble monuments above ground. Project Peacemaker was born from the intersection of several institutional failures that had plagued American foreign policy throughout the Cold War era. The inability of conventional military forces to address asymmetric threats, the limitations of intelligence agencies operating under legal constraints designed for a simpler world, and the growing recognition that enemies of the state had adapted their tactics to exploit the moral scruples that prevented democratic societies from employing the most effective methods of neutralizing opposition. The architects of this classified program understood that traditional military training produced soldiers who were constrained by rules of engagement, international law, and moral frameworks that had been developed for conflicts between nation-states rather than the shadowy warfare that characterized modern international relations. What was needed was a new breed of operative who could function effectively in environments where conventional ethical considerations were not merely inadequate, but actively counterproductive to achieving strategic objectives. Christopher Smith's psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for this experimental program, not despite his history of war crimes, but because of the psychological patterns that had made such atrocities possible. The military psychologists who reviewed his case recognized that his capacity for systematic violence, combined with his intellectual sophistication, created a unique asset that could be shaped and directed toward purposes that served national interests while remaining psychologically sustainable for the operative involved. The recruitment approach employed by Pentagon officials reflected their understanding that Christopher's participation would need to be presented as an opportunity for redemption rather than simply another form of exploitation. The language used in their initial contact emphasized themes of patriotic duty, the chance to serve his country in ways that his previous actions had made impossible, and the possibility of channeling his demonstrated capabilities toward purposes that would ultimately serve the cause of peace and security. The legal framework that enabled Christopher's release from federal prison involved complex negotiations between military justice officials, intelligence agencies, and congressional oversight committees that had to balance competing interests in accountability, operational security, and pragmatic effectiveness. The agreement that emerged from these discussions created a new category of military service that existed outside normal chains of command while remaining technically subject to oversight mechanisms that were themselves classified and compartmentalized. The training facility where Project Peacemaker was conducted occupied several thousand acres of isolated desert terrain in the American Southwest, far from population centers and media attention that might compromise operational security or attract unwanted scrutiny from civil liberties organizations. The physical infrastructure resembled a combination of military base, university campus, and maximum security prison, reflecting the complex purposes that the program was designed to serve. The other participants in Project Peacemaker represented a carefully selected cross-section of military personnel whose conventional careers had been derailed by actions or circumstances that made them unsuitable for normal duty, assignments yet potentially valuable for operations that required capabilities beyond those possessed by typical soldiers. Their backgrounds included court-martialed officers, discharged special forces personnel, intelligence operatives whose covers had been blown, and career military men whose psychological profiles suggested they possessed the flexibility necessary to operate in moral grey areas. The curriculum that governed their daily activities combined elements of advanced military training, psychological conditioning, and ideological indoctrination that were designed to create operatives who could function effectively in situations where normal moral constraints would interfere with mission accomplishment. The physical training regimen exceeded anything that participants had experienced in conventional military service, pushing human capabilities to their absolute limits while building the kind of physical confidence that would enable them to operate independently in hostile environments. The weapons training component of the program introduced participants to equipment and techniques that were not available to conventional military units, including experimental technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for use by democratic governments. The emphasis was placed not merely on tactical proficiency, but on developing the kind of creative thinking that would allow operatives to adapt their methods to unique situations that could not be anticipated by standard training. Protocols. The psychological conditioning aspects of the program were perhaps the most sophisticated and controversial elements of the entire project, involving techniques that had been developed through decades of research into behavior modification, mind control, and the manipulation of human consciousness. The goal was not simply to overcome normal moral inhibitions, but to restructure the participants' fundamental understanding of ethics, loyalty, and personal identity in ways that would make them capable of actions that would be psychologically devastating to conventional soldiers. Christopher's response to this conditioning was notably different from that of other participants, reflecting the fact that his psychological development had already been profoundly altered by childhood trauma and military experience. Where others struggled to reconcile the program's demands with their existing moral frameworks, he found in the training a validation of impulses and attitudes that he had been suppressing or rationalizing throughout his adult life. The permission to embrace violence as a tool for achieving higher purposes felt like coming home to a country he had always known existed but had never been allowed to visit. The brainwashing techniques employed in Project Peacemaker drew upon research conducted by intelligence agencies throughout the Cold War period, incorporating insights from studies of prisoners of war, cult deprogramming, and experimental psychology that explored the boundaries of human malleability under controlled conditions. The methods were sophisticated enough to avoid detection by participants who possessed advanced education and training in recognizing manipulation, yet powerful enough to produce fundamental changes in personality and moral reasoning. The ideological framework that was implanted during this conditioning process presented violence not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good when employed in service of higher principles, transforming traditional moral categories in ways that made mass killing seem not merely acceptable, but admirable, when conducted by individuals with sufficient understanding of strategic necessity. The concepts of peace, justice, and national security were redefined in terms that made their pursuit through violent means seem like the height of moral sophistication rather than ethical corruption. The practical training exercises that tested participants' integration of these new moral frameworks involved simulations that gradually escalated in complexity and moral ambiguity, beginning with scenarios that resembled conventional military operations and progressing towards situations that required actions that would be considered war crimes under international law. The evaluation criteria focused not on adherence to traditional ethical standards but on effectiveness in achieving assigned objectives regardless of the methods required. Christopher's performance during these exercises was exemplary according to the program's twisted standards, demonstrating his ability to plan and execute operations that maximize strategic impact while minimizing political fallout through careful attention to operational security and plausible deniability. His tactical innovations frequently impressed instructors who had extensive experience in covert operations, revealing a natural aptitude for the kind of thinking that made successful black operations possible. The final phases of training involved live exercises conducted in foreign countries where American interests were threatened by insurgent groups, terrorist organizations, or hostile governments that provided convenient targets for testing the operatives' capabilities under actual combat conditions. These missions were designed to appear like independent actions by local forces, while providing Project Peacemaker participants with experience in conducting operations that could not be officially acknowledged or supported. The psychological impact of these live exercises on most participants was profound and traumatic, forcing them to confront the reality of what they had been trained to become, while operating in environments where the theoretical frameworks of their conditioning encountered the messy realities of actual human suffering. Many experienced psychological breakdowns that required extensive therapy and careful management to prevent compromising revelations about the program's existence and methods. Christopher's reaction to actual deployment was notably different from that of his fellow trainees, reflecting the fact that his psychological conditioning had built upon foundations that were already adapted to systematic violence and moral flexibility. The live operations felt familiar rather than shocking, confirming his understanding that he had finally found his proper place in a world that rewarded the qualities that civilian society had sought to suppress or redirect. The political crisis that ultimately led to the termination of Project Peacemaker began with the Watergate scandal and the broader investigation of intelligence community overreach that followed President Nixon's resignation from office. Congressional oversight committees that had previously been content to approve classified programs without detailed scrutiny suddenly demanded comprehensive reviews of activities that had been conducted with minimal supervision during the calm height of Cold War tensions. The incoming Ford administration faced a choice between defending controversial programs that had been initiated by their predecessors or demonstrating their commitment to governmental reform by terminating activities that violated both legal standards and moral principles that most Americans believed should govern their country's behavior. The political calculus strongly favored dramatic gestures that would signal a break from the policies that had led to the constitutional crisis surrounding Nixon's presidency. The decision to shut down Project Peacemaker was announced through classified channels with minimal explanation or justification, leaving participants and instructors with little understanding of the reasoning behind the termination or the implications for their own futures. The training facility was placed in mothball status with remarkable speed, reflecting the administration's desire to minimize political exposure from programs that could prove embarrassing if their details became public knowledge. The psychological impact of this sudden termination on Project Peacemaker participants was severe and largely unanticipated by officials who had focused on the political benefits of ending controversial programs without considering the human costs of abandoning operatives whose conditioning had made them unsuitable for reintegration into normal society. The men who had been psychologically reconstructed to function as sanctioned killers were suddenly told that their services were no longer required and that they should return to civilian life as if nothing had happened. Christopher's response to the program's termination reflected his superior understanding of institutional dynamics and his recognition that official abandonment was simply another form of authorization for independent action. Rather than experiencing the psychological crisis that affected many of his fellow trainees, he interpreted the shutdown as evidence that his conditioning had been successful and that he was now ready to operate without institutional support or oversight. The base closure procedures were conducted with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that characterized military operations, yet they failed to account for the possibility that participants might choose to continue their activities outside official channels. The assumption that psychological conditioning could be reversed through simple administrative action revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what the program had accomplished and the kind of individuals it had created. The year that Christopher spent wandering through Europe and Asia following his unofficial release from Project Peacemaker was a period of psychological integration during which he processed the implications of his training and conditioning while exploring how his new capabilities might be employed in service of purposes that transcended national boundaries. The mental programming that had been designed to create a loyal American operative evolved into something more grandiose and personally satisfying, a mission to impose peace upon a world that seemed incapable of achieving it through democratic processes. The inheritance that awaited Christopher upon his return to civilization consisted not merely of the material wealth that his father had accumulated through legitimate and illegitimate means, but of a deeper legacy of moral flexibility and intellectual sophistication that had been refined through decades of experience in rationalizing systematic violence. Wolfgang Schmidt's business empire had survived the transition from Nazi Germany to Cold War Europe through careful attention to political trends and strategic partnerships with successive governing regimes. The legal mechanisms that had preserved this wealth during the chaos of post-war reconstruction were complex and sophisticated, involving trusts, shell corporations, and international banking relationships that had been designed to survive political upheavals and governmental investigations. The lawyers who had managed these arrangements during Christopher's absence were experienced professionals who asked no questions about the sources of their clients' resources or the purposes for which they might be employed. The Swiss banking system that had facilitated Wolfgang's financial operations provided Christopher with access to resources that exceeded the budgets of many small nations, creating possibilities for independent action that were limited only by his imagination and his ability to maintain operational security. The discretion and efficiency that characterized Swiss financial institutions made them ideal partners for activities that required absolute confidentiality and protection from governmental oversight. The establishment of the Pax Institute as Christopher's public face represented a masterpiece of institutional camouflage that allowed him to pursue violent objectives while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian purpose and Pax philanthropic commitment. The organization's stated mission of promoting peace through conflict resolution and victim assistance provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering, weapons acquisition, and operational planning that served very different purposes than those described in grant applications and annual reports. The staff that Christopher recruited for the Pax Institute consisted primarily of legitimate peace activists and humanitarian workers whose genuine commitment to their stated mission provided authentic credentials and emotional authenticity that made the organization's cover virtually impenetrable to casual investigation. Their sincere belief in the Institute's humanitarian purposes created an atmosphere of moral righteousness that satisfied even sophisticated observers while concealing the true nature of the activities being conducted in the organization's name. The funding mechanisms that supported Pax Institute operations drew upon Christopher's inherited wealth, while also attracting contributions from governments, foundations, and private donors who were impressed by the organization's apparent effectiveness in addressing international conflicts and humanitarian crises. The financial resources that resulted from this multi-stream approach exceeded what would have been necessary for legitimate peace-building activities, providing Christopher with the surplus needed to fund his more clandestine operations. The international network of contacts and relationships that Christopher developed through his Pax Institute activities provided him with intelligence assets, logistical support, and operational cover that would have been impossible to acquire through purely criminal or mercenary channels. Governments that would never have officially sanctioned his methods were often willing to provide unofficial assistance when his objectives aligned with their strategic interests, and his operations offered plausible deniability for actions they could not publicly support. The technological development program that Christopher initiated using Pax Institute resources and his inherited wealth represented the practical application of insights gained through Project Peacemaker training combined with resources that exceeded anything available to conventional military or intelligence organizations. The goal was not simply to acquire advanced weapons and equipment, but to develop integrated systems that would enable single-operator missions against targets that would normally require team-based approaches. The research and development facilities that Christopher established in remote locations throughout Europe and Asia were staffed by scientists and engineers whose expertise had been acquired through legitimate academic and corporate careers, but whose current employment offered opportunities for innovation that were not constrained by ethical oversight or legal limitations that governed conventional military research. Their willingness to participate in projects whose ultimate purposes were concealed from them reflected both professional ambition and financial incentives that exceeded what they could earn through legitimate employment. The integration of advanced technology with psychological conditioning and tactical training created capabilities that exceeded anything that had been achieved through conventional military or intelligence programs, producing an individual whose destructive potential was limited only by his ability to maintain the psychological frameworks that made systematic violence psychologically sustainable. The result was not merely a highly effective killer, but a self-sustaining system of violence that could operate independently while maintaining the internal justifications necessary for long-term psychological stability. The emergence of Christopher Smith as the Peacemaker represented the culmination of processes that had begun with Wolfgang Schmidt's decision to serve evil in pursuit of order and had been refined through decades of institutional development and technological advancement. The man who emerged from this complex process of psychological and technological integration was no longer recognizably human in any conventional sense, yet remained sufficiently connected to human motivations and social structures to operate effectively within the world he sought to reshape according to his vision of perfect peace. The irony that this vision of peace required the systematic elimination of those who opposed it was lost on Christopher, whose conditioning and psychological development had made him incapable of recognizing the contradiction between his stated objectives and his chosen methods. In his understanding, violence was not the opposite of peace, but the necessary foundation upon which lasting tranquility could be built, a perspective that justified any action taken in service of this ultimate goal. The world that awaited the Peacemaker's intervention was one of chronic conflict and systematic suffering that seemed to validate his analysis of human nature and the inadequacy of conventional approaches to conflict resolution. The failures of diplomacy, the limitations of international law, and the persistent cycle of violence that characterized international relations all served as evidence that more decisive methods were not merely justified, but morally required to break patterns that democratic societies seemed incapable of addressing effectively. Yet the psychological mechanisms that enabled Christopher to function as Peacemaker also ensured that his interventions would perpetuate rather than resolve the cycles of violence he claimed to be addressing, for his methods created new grievances and new enemies, while eliminating the trust and cooperation that genuine peace required. The tragedy of his condition was not merely personal but systemic, representing the inevitable result of attempting to solve human problems through inhuman means, while maintaining the illusion that the ends could somehow justify the means employed to achieve them. The Alpine chateau that Christopher Smith had inherited from his father's blood-soaked legacy stood like a monument to the perverse intersection of cultured sophistication and systematic brutality, its pristine white facade gleaming against snow-capped peaks that had witnessed centuries of human conflict while remaining serenely indifferent to the moral struggles playing out in the valleys below. The building's architectural elegance spoke to Wolfgang Schmidt's refined aesthetic sensibilities, yet its isolated location and reinforced construction revealed the paranoia of a man who understood that his actions would eventually require him to defend himself against the consequences of his choices. The transformation of this monument to Nazi wealth into the operational headquarters of the Peacemaker required extensive modifications that remained invisible to casual observers, yet created capabilities that exceeded those of most military installations. The wine cellars that had once stored Wolfgang's collection of stolen vintages were excavated and expanded into a subterranean complex that housed workshops, laboratories, and armories capable of supporting operations that would have challenged the resources of nation-states. The descent from the chateau's elegant living spaces into these hidden depths represented more than simply a physical journey into the building's foundation. It symbolized Christopher's psychological transformation from the facade of civilized respectability that he maintained in his public role as head of the Pax Institute into the technological monster that emerged when diplomatic solutions proved inadequate to his vision of necessary change. The thick steel door that separated these two worlds was both practical security measure and psychological boundary marker, dividing the man who spoke eloquently about peace from the creature who prepared systematically for war. The armory that Christopher constructed in these expanded cellars represented the practical application of everything he had learned during his military service, Project Peacemaker conditioning, and years of independent research into the most advanced weapons technologies available through both legitimate and black market channels. The collection that resulted from these efforts exceeded the equipment inventories of most special forces units, while maintaining the kind of integration and accessibility that enabled rapid deployment by a single operator working without logistical support. The centerpiece of this technological arsenal was the helmet that would become the Peacemaker's most distinctive and terrifying signature weapon, a device that represented the perfect synthesis of Wolfgang Schmidt's industrial expertise, Christopher's military training, and cutting-edge materials science that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in personal protective equipment. The development process had required years of experimentation and refinement, combining insights from multiple scientific disciplines to create something that was simultaneously defensive tool and offensive weapon. The plastic composite material that formed the helmet's outer shell was impregnated with RDX explosive compound through a manufacturing process that Christopher had developed in collaboration with chemists whose discretion had been purchased along with their expertise. The resulting structure was stable under normal conditions, yet capable of being detonated through electronic triggers that could be activated either deliberately or automatically under circumstances that Christopher had programmed into the device's control systems. The practical implications of wearing a helmet constructed from explosive materials were both tactical and psychological, creating a weapon that could not be taken from him, while also serving as the ultimate deterrent against capture or interrogation by enemies who might seek to exploit his knowledge for their own purposes. The knowledge that his own death was literally at his fingertips provided Christopher with a sense of control and autonomy that compensated for the isolation and paranoia that characterized his psychological condition. The electronic systems integrated into the helmet's explosive structure represented the most advanced communications and surveillance technology available through Christopher's network of military contractors, defense researchers, and intelligence community contacts, who were willing to provide cutting-edge equipment to clients who paid premium prices and asked no questions about intended applications. The resulting capabilities exceeded those available to most government agencies while maintaining the kind of reliability and durability required for field operations. The laser system that was built into the helmet's forward section was based on experimental military research into directed energy weapons that had been abandoned by official programs due to power consumption and heat dissipation, problems that Christopher's engineers had solved through innovative applications of superconducting materials and advanced cooling systems. The resulting weapon was capable of cutting through steel barriers or inflicting precise damage on electronic systems while remaining compact enough for integration into portable equipment. The communications array that occupied much of the helmet's internal volume provided Christopher with access to virtually every form of electronic communication available to civilian and military users, including encrypted government channels that his intelligence contacts had provided access to through methods that they preferred not to discuss in detail. The ability to monitor and intercept communications across such a broad spectrum gave him intelligence advantages that were crucial for planning and executing operations against targets who believed their communications were secure. The radar and surveillance systems integrated into the helmet's design allowed Christopher to maintain situational awareness that exceeded what was available to most military units, providing real-time information about the location and movement of potential threats across extended perimeters. The data processing capabilities required to manage and interpret this information stream were provided by computer systems that represented the most advanced artificial intelligence technology available through his network of academic and corporate contacts. The Derringer that Christopher carried as his primary sidearm represented a deliberate choice to employ technology that was both sophisticated and deliberately understated, reflecting his understanding that the most effective weapons were often those that appeared innocuous to casual observation. The compact pistol's small caliber and traditional design concealed advanced metallurgy and precision manufacturing that enabled it to fire specialized ammunition designed for specific tactical applications. The less lethal ammunition that the Derringer was designed to accommodate included a variety of exotic projectiles that could incapacitate targets through chemical, electrical, or kinetic means without causing the kind of permanent injury that might complicate Christopher's public image as a peace advocate. The ability to neutralize opponents without killing them provided tactical flexibility that was particularly valuable during operations where collateral damage needed to be minimized for political or strategic reasons. The chemical projectiles available for the Derringer included compounds that could induce temporary paralysis, unconsciousness, or psychological disorientation without leaving traces that would be detectable through routine forensic examination. The development of these substances had required collaboration with biochemists, whose research into neurotoxins and psychoactive compounds provided the foundation for weapons that operated at the intersection of chemistry and psychology. The electrical projectiles that Christopher had developed for use in the Derringer delivered controlled amounts of electrical energy that could disrupt nervous system function or electronic equipment depending on the specific requirements of particular tactical situations. The precision with which these devices could be calibrated allowed him to achieve effects ranging from mild discomfort to complete incapacitation while maintaining the ability to adjust his response based on real-time assessment of threat levels and operational requirements. The gloves that completed Christopher's personal equipment represented perhaps the most innovative aspect of his technological development program, incorporating chemical weapons capabilities into a delivery system that appeared completely innocuous while providing devastating offensive potential in close-quarters combat situations. The development of these devices had required extensive experimentation with volatile compounds and sophisticated triggering mechanisms that could be activated through simple hand movements. The firebomb capability, built into the gloves, was based on binary chemical principles that kept the reactive components separated until deliberate action brought them into contact under conditions that produced immediate and intense combustion. The vials containing these chemicals were integrated into the glove's structure in ways that made them virtually undetectable, while providing reliable access during combat situations that required split-second responses. The activation mechanism for the firebomb system was designed to be intuitive and reliable under stress conditions, requiring only the kind of hand movement that would be natural during combat, while providing sufficient safeguards to prevent accidental detonation during routine activities. The resulting weapon could produce flame temperatures that exceeded those generated by conventional incendiary devices, while maintaining sufficient control to allow precise targeting of specific objectives. The boots that Christopher wore as part of his Peacemaker ensemble incorporated explosive compounds in their heel sections, providing him with demolition capabilities that could be employed for breaching barriers destroying evidence, or creating diversions that would facilitate escape from compromised operational situations. The integration of these explosive systems into footwear that appeared conventional reflected his commitment to maintaining operational security through careful attention to equipment design and appearance. The pentoxide compounds used in the boot heels were selected for their stability under normal conditions and their explosive power when activated through electronic triggers that Christopher could control through his helmet's integrated systems. The placement of these charges in footwear provided tactical advantages that included the ability to create explosive effects while maintaining hand mobility for other weapons systems. The integration of all these weapons systems into a single ensemble that could be worn and operated by an individual reflected Christopher's understanding that modern conflict required capabilities that could adapt quickly to changing tactical situations while maintaining the kind of mobility and flexibility that enabled operations across diverse environments and against varied target sets. The result was a walking weapons platform that exceeded the capabilities of most military units while remaining compact enough for covert deployment. The testing and refinement process that had been required to develop these integrated systems had taken place over several years of careful experimentation and evaluation, conducted in remote locations where Christopher could experiment with explosive devices and advanced weapons without attracting attention from law enforcement or intelligence agencies that might interfere with his development program. The methodical approach he had employed reflected both his scientific training and his understanding of the importance of reliability in equipment that his life might depend upon. The psychological impact of donning this technological ensemble was profound and transformative, providing Christopher with physical capabilities that seemed to validate his grandiose sense of mission, while also serving as external reinforcement for the identity transformation that converted Christopher Smith, the peace advocate, into validate Peacemaker, the violent enforcer. The ritual of arming himself with these sophisticated weapons systems became a form of psychological preparation that enabled him to access the conditioning and training that made systematic violence possible. The first operational employment of this complete weapons package had come during his confrontation with Emil Bork, the arms dealer whose activities in South America had provided Christopher with the perfect opportunity to test his equipment and methods under actual combat conditions. The mission had served multiple purposes beyond the immediate objective of preventing a regional conflict, providing valuable data about the performance of his weapon systems and the effectiveness of his tactical approaches. The intelligence gathering phase that had preceded his action against Bork demonstrated the importance of the surveillance and communications capabilities built into his helmet, providing him with detailed information about his target's activities, associates, and security measures that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional intelligence methods. The ability to monitor electronic communications and track the movements of key personnel had enabled him to plan his intervention with precision that minimized risks while maximizing operational impact. The decision to employ nerve gas against the South American military forces that were being manipulated by Bork represented Christopher's first use of chemical weapons in actual combat, testing both the effectiveness of his delivery systems and his psychological ability to employ weapons of mass destruction against human targets. The results had exceeded his expectations in terms of both tactical effectiveness and his own emotional response to witnessing the effects of his weapons on living beings. The aerial combat that had characterized the final phase of his operation against Bork had provided valuable experience in employing his weapon systems under dynamic conditions that tested both his technical skills as a pilot and his ability to operate his personal equipment while managing the complex demands of flying experimental aircraft. The successful destruction of Bork's bomber had validated his approach to integrating personal weapons with conventional military hardware. The philosophical framework that Christopher had developed to justify these methods represented the culmination of his psychological conditioning and his intellectual attempts to reconcile his actions with his stated commitment to promoting peace. The logic that emerged from this process was internally consistent yet fundamentally divorced from normal moral reasoning, creating a worldview that transformed mass murder into moral imperative through sophisticated but ultimately perverted reasoning. The concept of violence as the ultimate diplomatic solution reflected Christopher's understanding that conventional peace-building methods failed because they did not address the fundamental reality that some individuals and groups were simply incapable of coexisting peacefully with others. In his analysis, the application of sufficient force to eliminate such disruptive elements was not merely justified, but morally required to protect innocent populations from the consequences of continued conflict. The technological sophistication of his weapons systems served to reinforce this philosophical framework by providing him with capabilities that seemed to prove the superiority of direct action over the inefficient and unreliable processes of negotiation, compromise, and gradual change that characterize democratic approaches to conflict resolution. The precision and effectiveness of his equipment created the illusion that complex human problems could be solved through the application of sufficient technical expertise and moral clarity. The isolation that resulted from Christopher's transformation into Peacemaker was both practical necessity and psychological consequence, for his methods required operational security that made normal human relationships impossible, while his conditioning had destroyed his capacity for the kind of emotional connection that might have provided alternative sources of meaning and purpose. The technological enhancement of his capabilities had come at the cost of his humanity, creating a creature that was more than human in terms of destructive potential, yet less than human in terms of moral and emotional development. The cycle of violence that began with Christopher's first mission as Peacemaker would prove to be self-perpetuating and escalating, as each successful operation validated his methods, while creating new enemies and new justifications for continued action. The technology that had been designed to serve his vision of peace had instead become the engine of a war that could never end, for it was fought not against external enemies, but against the fundamental human tendency toward conflict that could never be permanently eliminated through violent means. The tragedy of Christopher's transformation into the Peacemaker was that it represented the ultimate corruption of genuine peace-building impulses and sophisticated technological capabilities, creating something that was simultaneously impressive in its technical achievement and horrifying in its moral emptiness. The walking weapon that emerged from years of careful development and psychological conditioning was a testament to human ingenuity and a warning about what could happen when such ingenuity was divorced from the wisdom and compassion that should guide its application. The voices that began to whisper in Christopher Smith's mind during the quiet hours following his first mission as Peacemaker emerged not as sudden intrusions, but as gradual realizations that he was no longer alone within the confines of his own consciousness. The transition from solitary thought to internal dialogue was so subtle that he initially dismissed these new presences as manifestations of stress or exhaustion, psychological artifacts produced by the intense concentration required to plan and execute operations that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. Yet as days passed and the voices grew stronger and more distinct, Christopher began to recognize patterns and personalities that suggested something far more profound than simple mental fatigue or temporary psychological disturbance. The souls of those he had killed seemed to have taken up permanent residence within his mind, transforming his helmet from a technological marvel into a spiritual repository where the consciousness of his victims continued to exist in forms that defied rational explanation, yet felt absolutely real to the man who carried them. The first and strongest of these voices belonged to his father Wolfgang, whose presence in Christopher's mind represented both psychological inheritance and supernatural visitation, a ghostly manifestation of the Nazis' unfinished business that had been passed down to his son like a hereditary curse. Wolfgang's spectral voice carried with it all the authority and persuasive power that had once commanded a concentration camp, yet now its focus had shifted from implementing the final solution to guiding his son toward an even more ambitious project of global purification. The conversations that developed between Christopher and his father's ghost revealed the complex relationship between inherited trauma and personal choice, as Wolfgang's influence served both to justify actions that Christopher had already decided to take and to suggest new possibilities for violence that exceeded even his own considerable imagination. The dead Nazi's voice provided external validation for impulses that might otherwise have seemed excessive or unjustifiable, creating a feedback loop that reinforced Christopher's worst tendencies, while providing them with intellectual framework and historical precedent. Wolfgang's ghostly presence manifested not only through auditory hallucinations but through visual apparitions that appeared at moments of tactical decision-making or moral uncertainty, his SS uniform immaculate, and his expression bearing the same cold satisfaction that had characterized his supervision of mass murder decades earlier. These visions served as reminders of the family legacy that Christopher was continuing and extending, connecting his modern technological violence to the systematic extermination that had funded his inheritance and shaped his psychological development. The philosophical discussions that took place between Christopher and his father's spirit covered topics that ranged from tactical considerations about specific operations to broader questions about the nature of human consciousness and the proper relationship between superior and inferior forms of life. Wolfgang's perspective on these matters was informed by decades of experience in implementing ideological solutions to practical problems, providing Christopher with insights into the psychology of systematic killing that no military training or academic study could have provided. The additional voices that began to join Wolfgang in Christopher's mental conversations represented the accumulating consciousness of everyone he had killed during his missions as Peacemaker, creating a growing chorus of the dead that provided him with constant companionship, while also serving as a record of his operational achievements. Each new voice carried with it memories and experiences that enriched Christopher's understanding of human nature, while also providing him with tactical intelligence that could be applied to future operations. The phenomenon of hearing his victims' voices was interpreted by Christopher not as evidence of psychological breakdown, but as confirmation that his actions had achieved a form of immortality for those he had killed, preserving their consciousness within his own mind, rather than allowing it to be lost to the oblivion that claimed ordinary deaths. This rationalization transformed what might have been a source of guilt or remorse into a point of pride, evidence that his methods were superior to conventional killing because they preserved rather than destroyed the essential humanity of his targets. The tactical advice that the voices provided during planning and execution of operations reflected the diverse backgrounds and expertise of Christopher's victims, creating a virtual council of advisors whose knowledge encompassed everything from military strategy to financial manipulation to psychological warfare. The arms dealers, terrorists, and government officials who had fallen victim to his violence continued to serve his cause through their involuntary participation in his decision-making processes. The psychological comfort that Christopher derived from these constant internal conversations helped to alleviate the isolation that his methods and objectives had created, providing him with social interaction that was not constrained by the operational security requirements that made normal human relationships impossible. The voices understood his mission because they had experienced its effects directly, creating a form of communion between killer and victims that transcended the ordinary boundaries between life and death. The escalating nature of this psychological phenomenon created a self-reinforcing cycle where each new killing added another voice to the chorus that urged Christopher toward greater violence, making it increasingly difficult for him to contemplate alternative approaches to conflict resolution or to question the fundamental assumptions that guided his actions. The dead became his strongest advocates for creating more dead, ensuring that his methods would become more rather than less extreme as time passed. The missions that followed Christopher's initial success against Emil Bork provided ample opportunities for testing both his technological capabilities and his evolving relationship with the supernatural forces that seemed to guide his actions. The variety of threats that he encountered during this period demonstrated the global nature of the problems he had committed himself to solving, while also revealing the limitations of purely violent approaches to complex political and complex social conflicts. The Commodore represented Christopher's first encounter with an enemy whose technological sophistication matched his own, a submarine commander whose underwater fortress posed challenges that could not be addressed through conventional surface-based operations. The nuclear-powered vessel that served as the Commodore's base of operations was equipped with advanced sonar systems, torpedo tubes loaded with experimental warheads, and defensive measures that had been designed to repel attacks by conventional naval forces. The underwater battle that ensued when Christopher infiltrated the Commodore's submarine tested both his equipment and his psychological conditioning under conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The confined spaces and toxic atmosphere of the enemy vessel created tactical challenges that required improvisation and adaptation of his weapons systems, while the knowledge that failure would result not only in his own death but in the success of the Commodore's plan to trigger global nuclear conflict provided motivation that transcended normal self-preservation instincts. The nerve gas deployment that Christopher employed to neutralize the Commodore's crew represented his first use of chemical weapons in an enclosed environment, creating conditions that were potentially as dangerous to himself as to his targets, while providing valuable data about the effectiveness of his gas masks and filtration systems under extreme conditions. The sight of dozens of submarine personnel dying in agony from respiratory failure provided him with visceral satisfaction that was enhanced rather than diminished by the voices of previous victims who urged him to appreciate the artistic beauty of mass death. The nuclear reactor crisis that followed the Commodore's defeat required Christopher to demonstrate his willingness to sacrifice his own life in service of his mission, as the damaged submarine's power plant threatened to create a radioactive catastrophe that could have poisoned vast areas of ocean and coastline. The decision to fly directly into the reactor core to manually shut down the nuclear reaction represented both tactical necessity and psychological test, proving to himself and his spectral advisors that his commitment to peace through violence transcended even basic survival instincts. The successful resolution of the reactor crisis provided Christopher with a sense of moral validation that was reinforced by the grateful voices of the thousands of people whose lives had been saved through his intervention, even though they would never know that their continued existence depended on the actions of a man whose methods violated every principle of civilized conduct. The knowledge that he had prevented a nuclear disaster through personal sacrifice created psychological rewards that compensated for the physical trauma of radiation exposure and the ongoing deterioration of his already damaged psyche. The confrontation with Comrade Fedornich expanded Christopher's operational scope to include direct intervention in international diplomatic processes, as the Balkan diplomats' plan to trigger nuclear war between the superpowers required sophisticated understanding of geopolitical dynamics and alliance structures. that went far beyond the tactical considerations that had characterized his previous missions. The complexity of this threat demanded intelligence gathering and strategic planning that tested Christopher's analytical capabilities, while also requiring him to operate within the highest levels of international society. The diplomatic reception where Christopher first encountered Fedornik provided him with opportunities to employ the social skills and cultural sophistication that he had inherited from his father, demonstrating his ability to move seamlessly between the worlds of civilized discourse and systematic violence. The contrast between his polished exterior and his internal dialogue with the voices of the dead created a form of psychological tension that enhanced his performance in both roles, while also deepening his sense of separation from normal, human society. The assassination attempt that Christopher thwarted during the diplomatic gathering required split-second decision-making and precise application of his less lethal weapons systems, as the need to prevent Fedornich's death, while maintaining his own cover identity, created tactical challenges that had not been anticipated during his mission planning. The successful protection of his target paradoxically served his larger objectives by preventing the martyr effect that Fedornich's death might have created, while also providing him with intelligence about the diplomat's broader network of conspirators. The nuclear reactor infiltration that Christopher undertook to prevent Fedornik's plan from succeeding required him to overcome security measures that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of sabotage that he was planned from succeeding, testing both his technical skills and his psychological ability to function in environments where the margin for error was measured in microseconds rather than minutes or hours. The radiation exposure that resulted from this mission added to the cumulative damage that his body was accumulating from repeated exposure to exotic weapons and hostile environments. The dogfight that concluded his operation against Fedornich demonstrated Christopher's ability to integrate his personal weapons systems with conventional military aircraft, as his helmet's targeting systems and communication capabilities provided him with advantages that enabled a single pilot to defeat multiple opponents whose individual skills exceeded his own. The precision bombing run that eliminated Fedornich's stronghold represented the culmination of weeks of planning and preparation, yet the voices in his helmet insisted that the operation's success was due primarily to their guidance and wisdom, rather than his own tactical abilities. The encounter with Beale, the self-proclaimed master of the world, presented Christopher with his first genuinely superhuman opponent, as the uranium exposure that had transformed the villain into something beyond normal human limitations required tactics and weapons that pushed Christopher's equipment to its operational limits. The lost city that served as Beale's headquarters had been constructed using technology that defied conventional understanding of materials, science, and engineering, creating an environment where normal physical laws seemed suspended in favor of principles that operated according to the mutated consciousness of its creator. The battle that ensued within this otherworldly citadel tested not only Christopher's combat skills, but his psychological ability to maintain his sense of mission and identity when confronted with evidence that reality itself was more malleable than his scientific training had suggested. The uranium-powered abilities that Beale displayed included matter manipulation, energy projection, and limited telepathic capabilities that allowed him to perceive and respond to Christopher's thoughts and intentions before they could be translated into action. The tactical adaptations that Christopher was forced to develop during this confrontation included techniques for masking his mental processes from telepathic detection, methods for countering matter manipulation through rapid changes in position and approach vectors, and strategies for exploiting the psychological instabilities that seem to accompany superhuman transformation. The victory that he ultimately achieved over Beale was as much due to the villain's own internal contradictions as to Christopher's superior tactics or equipment. The defeat of Premier Geck required Christopher to engage in aerial combat against experimental aircraft whose capabilities exceeded those of conventional military fighters. As the Premier's new warplane incorporated stealth technology, advanced missile systems, and electronic countermeasures that had been designed specifically to neutralize the kinds of weapons that Christopher typically employed. The dogfight that resulted from this technological mismatch forced him to rely more heavily on improvisation and psychological warfare than on direct application of superior firepower. The nerve gas attack that Christopher launched against the Premier's ground forces represented an escalation in his use of chemical weapons, as the quantities and concentrations employed exceeded anything he had previously deployed, while also incorporating new compounds that had been designed to maximize psychological impact rather than simply causing death or incapacitation. The sight of hundreds of soldiers writhing in agony while their nervous systems shut down provided Christopher with satisfaction that was enhanced by the approving commentary from the voices in his helmet. The rescue of scientist Gerda from Enrico Lucetti's underwater city required Christopher to adapt his equipment and tactics for prolonged underwater operations. As the Italian physicist's submarine fortress had been constructed using principles that combined conventional naval architecture with experimental materials that enabled construction of permanently submerged habitats. The stealth infiltration that preceded the rescue operation tested Christopher's ability to remain undetected while moving through environments that had been designed to monitor and control every aspect of life within their boundaries. The confrontation with Colonel Uz represented a personal crisis for Christopher, as the arms thief's successful penetration of his Alpine headquarters forced him to acknowledge that his operational security had been compromised and that his sanctuary was no longer safe from enemy action. The decision to destroy his own base rather than allow his weapons and equipment to fall into enemy hands required him to abandon years of careful preparation and development while also eliminating the physical infrastructure that had enabled his transformation into Peacemaker. The explosive destruction of the Swiss facility was orchestrated with the same attention to detail and tactical precision that characterized all of Christopher's operations. Yet it also represented a profound psychological loss that was partially compensated by the voices of the dead, who assured him that this sacrifice was necessary for the continuation of his mission. The sight of his carefully constructed armory disappearing in a series of controlled explosions created emotional responses that Christopher had not experienced since witnessing his father's suicide, connecting this tactical necessity to the original trauma that had shaped his psychological development. The final confrontation with Mr. Blaze and his army of lava men represented the ultimate test of Christopher's equipment, tactics, and psychological conditioning, as the villain's control over geological forces created battlefield conditions that exceeded anything that Christopher had previously encountered or could have anticipated during his planning and preparation phases. The underground fortress that served as Blaze's headquarters was constructed within active volcanic formations that provided the villain with virtually unlimited access to molten rock and superheated gases that could be weaponized against intruders. The environmental challenges posed by operating within an active volcano required Christopher to push his protective equipment to its absolute limits, while also developing tactical approaches that could function effectively in conditions where normal military doctrine provided no guidance or precedent. The heat-resistant modifications that he was forced to make to his helmet and other equipment during the course of the battle demonstrated his ability to adapt and improvise under extreme stress while maintaining the technological sophistication that was essential to his operational effectiveness. The psychological impact of witnessing Blaze's army of lava men represented Christopher's first encounter with enemies that existed at the boundary between human and elemental consciousness, challenging his understanding of what constituted legitimate targets for his violence, while also providing the voices in his helmet with new forms of spiritual communion that transcended ordinary human experience. The destruction of these geological beings through precisely applied explosives and chemical weapons created spectacular visual effects that satisfied Christopher's aesthetic appreciation for well-executed violence. The victory over Blaze and his elemental forces marked the end of Christopher's initial campaign as Peacemaker, yet it also represented the beginning of a psychological evolution that would eventually consume whatever remained of his original human identity. The voices that now filled his helmet had grown into a full chorus of the dead, their constant commentary and advice transforming every moment of his existence into a collaborative effort between the living and the deceased to reshape the world according to principles that transcended conventional morality. The isolation that resulted from this supernatural communion was both complete and paradoxical, as Christopher had never been less alone yet never more separated from normal human society. The dead who inhabited his consciousness provided him with intellectual companionship and emotional support that living relationships could never have matched. Yet they also ensured that he would never again be capable of the kind of genuine human connection that might have provided alternative sources of meaning and purpose. The psychological trap that Christopher had created for himself was perfectly designed to perpetuate and escalate his violent activities, as each new killing provided him with additional internal companionship, while also creating new justifications for continued action. The dead demanded vengeance against the living who had not yet been enlightened through death, creating a moral framework that made peace through violence seem not merely justified, but spiritually necessary. The technological sophistication of his equipment had enabled Christopher to become the perfect killing machine, yet the psychological sophistication of his rationalization mechanisms had transformed him into something far more dangerous. A man who genuinely believed that mass murder was the highest form of moral action. The voices in his helmet had become the only truth he recognized, and that truth demanded that peace be purchased through the systematic elimination of everyone who opposed it. The cosmic upheaval that swept across infinite realities during the crisis on Infinite Earths represented far more than a simple reorganization of dimensional boundaries or the elimination of redundant timelines. It constituted a fundamental reimagining of what was possible within the framework of existence itself. As universes collapsed and reformed according to principles that transcended mortal understanding, beings who had operated in isolation within their own dimensional pockets suddenly found themselves thrust into a larger tapestry of reality where their actions would be measured against standards they had never previously encountered. For Christopher Smith, the integration into this expanded cosmos meant that his private war against those who threatened peace would now be conducted under the scrutiny of heroes whose moral clarity and operational methods stood in stark contrast to everything he had become. The DC universe into which he was absorbed operated according to principles that valued individual conscience over institutional authority, that sought to preserve rather than eliminate opposition, and that maintained faith in the possibility of redemption, even for those who had committed the most heinous crimes. The military structure that initially contained Christopher's activities within official channels was headed by Colonel Valentina Vostok, a woman whose own complex relationship with superhuman capabilities and government service provided her with insights into the psychological challenges faced by individuals whose abilities exceeded normal human limitations. Her experience as Negative Woman had taught her that power, without proper moral guidance, inevitably led to corruption and destruction. Yet her position within the intelligence community required her to employ assets whose methods she personally found distasteful. Vostok's collaboration with General Peterson reflected the pragmatic realities of managing dangerous individuals whose capabilities made them valuable to national security objectives, while their psychological instabilities made them unsuitable for conventional military service. Peterson's frank acknowledgement that Christopher was off his rocker demonstrated a level of honest assessment that was rare within intelligence circles. Yet his willingness to continue employing such an obviously unstable asset revealed the moral compromises that characterized post-Cold War American foreign policy. The surveillance network that Peterson established to monitor Christopher's activities represented both prudent, operational security and implicit acknowledgement that the man they were employing was as dangerous to his handlers as to his targets. The agents assigned to track his movements through Switzerland and other operational areas were experienced professionals who understood that they were not merely gathering intelligence but serving as early warning systems for a weapon that might turn against its wielders at any moment. The loss of contact with Christopher during his Swiss operations was interpreted by his handlers not as evidence of successful mission accomplishment, but as confirmation of their worst fears about employing individuals whose psychological conditioning made them fundamentally unreliable partners in any collaborative effort. The silence that followed his departure from monitored locations created anxiety within the intelligence community that was partially relieved only when he resurfaced during international crises that aligned with American strategic interests. The terrorist airline hijacking that brought Christopher back into official awareness represented the kind of scenario that his conditioning and equipment were perfectly designed to address, yet it also provided the first clear demonstration of how his methods differed fundamentally from those employed by legitimate heroes who operated according to moral principles rather than pure tactical effectiveness. The precision with which he eliminated the hijackers was matched only by the casual brutality with which he dispatched anyone who might have provided useful intelligence about their broader network. The presence of vigilante aboard the hijacked aircraft introduced Christopher to the concept of heroism as it was understood within the DC universe, where individuals with exceptional capabilities chose to risk their own lives in service of protecting innocent people rather than pursuing personal or political agendas. Dave Winston's decision to confront the terrorists without lethal weapons and his attempts to minimize civilian casualties represented an approach to conflict resolution that was completely alien to Christopher's experience and training. The confrontation between Peacemaker and the original vigilante occurred with the kind of swift violence that characterized Christopher's operational methods, yet it also revealed fundamental differences in philosophy that made cooperation between them impossible. Where Vigilante sought to capture and interrogate the terrorists to gather intelligence that might prevent future attacks, Christopher viewed elimination as the most efficient solution to immediate tactical problems regardless of the broader implications. The moment when Christopher emptied his weapon into Vigilante's chest represented more than simple tactical decision-making. It constituted a declaration of war against the moral principles that governed heroic action within the DC universe. The deliberate murder of someone who was attempting to protect innocent lives demonstrated that Christopher's concept of peace was fundamentally incompatible with any framework that valued individual conscience or moral restraint. The sight of Dave Winston falling from the aircraft in a pool of his own blood served as a catalyst for Adrian Chase's transformation into the new vigilante, creating a cycle of vengeance that would define Christopher's integration into the broader community of costumed operatives. Chase's assumption of his fallen colleague's identity represented both tribute to Winston's sacrifice and commitment to bringing his killer to justice through methods that honored rather than betrayed the original. Vigilante's moral principles. The psychological impact of witnessing such casual murder created in Adrian Chase a form of focused determination that matched Christopher's own obsessive commitment to his mission. Yet it was guided by moral principles that sought to preserve rather than destroy the fabric of civilized society. The new vigilante's vow to hunt down Peacemaker established a dynamic that would test both men's capabilities while also revealing the fundamental differences between heroism and vigilantism when carried to their logical extremes. Colonel Vostok's approach to Adrian Chase reflected her understanding that the new vigilante's personal investment in capturing Christopher made him both a valuable asset and a potential liability in operations that required careful coordination and strategic thinking rather than emotionally driven pursuit of personal vengeance. Her request for assistance in tracking both the terrorist leader and Peacemaker acknowledged the complexity of a situation where the cure had proven more dangerous than the disease. The helicopter pursuit that Vostok's agents conducted across urban rooftops demonstrated the resources and determination that official agencies were willing to commit to containing Christopher's activities, yet it also revealed the limitations of conventional law enforcement methods when applied to individuals whose training and equipment exceeded what normal criminals possessed. The chase sequence showcased Christopher's ability to evade official capture while also highlighting the collateral damage that such pursuits inevitably created. The ship-based confrontation that brought Peacemaker and the new vigilante together for their first direct encounter occurred within the confined spaces of a terrorist stronghold, where their conflicting approaches to violence and justice created tactical complications that benefited their common enemies. The enclosed environment of the vessel made conventional pursuit and evasion impossible, while also limiting the weapons and methods that could be employed without risking the destruction of valuable intelligence materials. The mutual suspicion that characterized the initial interaction between Christopher and Adrian reflected their accurate assessment of each other as representing fundamentally incompatible approaches to crime fighting, yet the immediate tactical situation required them to cooperate against enemies whose firepower exceeded what either could handle individually. The temporary alliance that emerged from necessity demonstrated both men's professional competence while also highlighting the philosophical differences that made genuine partnership impossible. The ultrasonics deployment that Christopher employed to neutralize the terrorists aboard the ship represented one of his more sophisticated non-lethal approaches, yet even this relatively restrained application of force created effects that were designed to cause maximum pain and disorientation rather than simple incapacitation. The precision with which he calibrated the sonic weapons to achieve specific physiological effects demonstrated his technical expertise, while also revealing his fundamental indifference to the suffering of his targets. The argument over who would have the right to kill the terrorist leader revealed the core philosophical difference between Peacemaker and Vigilante, as Christopher's psychological need to personally eliminate his enemies conflicted with Adrian's commitment to capturing suspects for trial and imprisonment through legal processes. The voices in Christopher's helmet demanded the satisfaction of witnessing another death, creating internal pressure that made compromise or negotiation with his temporary ally impossible. The brief physical altercation that erupted between the two men demonstrated their roughly equal capabilities in hand-to-hand combat, while also showing how personal animosity could override tactical considerations, even in situations where continued cooperation would have served both their interests. The fight was interrupted by the arrival of official law enforcement, forcing both men to abandon their dispute in favor of escape and evasion activities. The investigation conducted by Lieutenant Harry Stein and Colonel Vostok in the aftermath of the ship incident revealed the frustration that official agencies experienced when dealing with vigilantes whose methods exceeded legal boundaries, while producing results that conventional law enforcement could not achieve through proper channels. The evidence of terrorist elimination, combined with the absence of useful intelligence or captured suspects, created bureaucratic problems that had no clear solutions within existing legal frameworks. Christopher's retreat to his Swiss compound following this confrontation provided him with time to process the implications of his encounter with heroes who operated according to moral principles that he found both incomprehensible and tactically inefficient. The voices of the dead who inhabited his helmet offered commentary on these new opponents that was generally dismissive of their restraint and critical of their failure to embrace the logical necessity of eliminating enemies permanently. The physical training regimen that Christopher maintained during this period of reflection was designed to prepare him for future encounters with opponents whose capabilities might exceed those of conventional terrorists or military personnel. The integration of new tactical approaches with his existing weapon systems required extensive experimentation and refinement to ensure that he would not be caught unprepared by heroes whose moral constraints did not extend to accepting defeat when their principles were challenged. The paranoid delusion that began to develop in Christopher's mind regarding Harry Stein's true identity reflected the psychological pressure created by operating within a universe where his methods were not merely questioned but actively opposed by individuals whose power and determination matched his own. The inability to distinguish between legitimate law enforcement officers and potential terrorist infiltrators demonstrated how his isolation and conditioning had damaged his capacity for rational threat assessment. The decision to return to America for the purpose of eliminating what he perceived as a terrorist threat represented Christopher's first direct challenge to official authority within the DC universe, moving beyond the grey areas of international operations into direct confrontation with domestic law enforcement agencies that had legitimate jurisdiction and broad public support. The escalation from foreign military actions to domestic terrorism marked a crucial turning point in his psychological development. The sniper position that Christopher established atop the United States Capitol building demonstrated both his tactical sophistication and his complete disregard for the symbolic significance of American democratic institutions, treating the seat of government as simply another terrain feature to be exploited for operational advantage. The choice of such a visible and politically sensitive location revealed his growing disconnection from social and political realities that most criminals would recognize as boundaries not to be crossed. The firefight that erupted between Christopher and the combined forces of Harry Stein and Valentina Vostok tested his equipment and training against opponents who possessed both official authority and superhuman capabilities, creating tactical challenges that exceeded anything he had previously encountered during his criminal career. The ability of his adversaries to coordinate their attacks while maintaining communication with backup forces demonstrated the advantages that legitimate heroes possessed through their connections to established institutions and support networks. The ultrasonic weapon deployment that Christopher employed during his escape from the Capitol building represented a tactical innovation that took advantage of his opponent's moral constraints, as the indiscriminate nature of sonic attacks created civilian casualties that his pursuers were obligated to address rather than continuing their pursuit. The psychological warfare aspect of using innocent bystanders as tactical assets demonstrated the complete absence of moral limitation that characterized his operational methods. The continuation of his surveillance and harassment activities, even after his escape from immediate capture, revealed Christopher's inability to recognize when tactical situations had shifted beyond his ability to control. his obsessive need to complete missions overriding rational assessment of risk and probability of success. The installation of electronic monitoring equipment within federal buildings demonstrated technical capabilities that exceeded those of most international intelligence services, while also constituting acts of espionage that carried severe, legal penalties. The return visit to Vostok's office that Christopher conducted after security forces had departed represented a level of operational boldness that bordered on self-destructive recklessness, yet it also demonstrated his psychological need to confront and defeat opponents who had successfully resisted his initial attacks. The voices of the dead who guided his actions insisted that such challenges to his authority could not be allowed to stand without decisive response that would re-establish his dominance. The second confrontation with Stein and Vostok in her office environment tested Christopher's ability to operate effectively within confined spaces while dealing with multiple opponents whose capabilities complemented each other in ways that multiplied their individual effectiveness. The teamwork displayed by his adversaries represented a form of tactical coordination that his solitary operational methods could not match, creating disadvantages that his superior equipment could not fully overcome. The intervention by the new vigilante at the crucial moment of Christopher's apparent victory demonstrated how his past actions continued to influence present circumstances, as Adrian Chase's personal vendetta provided motivation for involvement in conflicts that might otherwise have been resolved through official channels. The knockout blow that ended Christopher's resistance represented both tactical defeat and psychological trauma for someone whose entire identity was built upon the maintenance of control through superior violence. The arrest and imprisonment that followed Christopher's capture represented his first extended exposure to the American criminal justice system since his court-martial and federal imprisonment years earlier, yet his psychological condition had deteriorated sufficiently that he was no longer capable of the successful adaptation to incarceration that had characterized his earlier experience. The accumulation of voices in his helmet had reached levels that made normal social interaction virtually impossible, while also creating internal pressure for continued violent action that could not be satisfied within prison constraints. The judicial proceedings that would determine Christopher's fate were complicated by the jurisdictional questions raised by his activities across multiple federal agencies and international boundaries, creating legal complexities that were further complicated by the classified nature of his original military service and intelligence community employment. The prosecution's challenge was to present evidence of his crimes without revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations or national security interests. The defense strategies available to Christopher's legal representatives were limited by his obvious guilt regarding the charges against him and his apparent psychological inability to participate meaningfully in his own defense, as the voices that now dominated his consciousness made it impossible for him to distinguish between reality and the supernatural guidance that he believed was directing his actions. The psychiatric evaluations that were conducted during his pre-trial detention revealed a level of mental deterioration that raised questions about his competency to stand trial, while also documenting the extent of his transformation from military officer to psychotic killer. The prison environment that awaited Christopher was populated by individuals whose criminal activities had brought them into conflict with the same heroic community that now considered him a significant threat, creating social dynamics where his reputation as someone who had successfully challenged established heroes provided him with status and protection that his previous incarceration had not afforded. The respect that he commanded among fellow inmates was based not on moral authority, but on recognition of his effectiveness in achieving violent objectives that others could only fantasize about accomplishing. The psychological impact of this imprisonment on Christopher was profound and transformative, as the forced inactivity and restricted access to weapons and targets created conditions where the voices of the dead became his primary source of stimulation and guidance. The supernatural chorus that now filled every moment of his existence began to evolve beyond simple commentary on his past actions, to include detailed planning for future operations that would exceed anything he had previously attempted in terms of scope and destructive impact. The release from federal custody that eventually came to Christopher Smith arrived not through legal proceedings or successful appeals, but through the complex machinations of intelligence agencies that continued to view him as a valuable asset, despite the obvious deterioration of his psychological condition and his demonstrated inability to operate within normal command structures. The bureaucratic mechanisms that facilitated his freedom operated according to principles that prioritized operational utility over public safety, reflecting the moral compromises that had become endemic within post-Cold War American foreign policy. The advanced battlecopter that awaited Christopher's return to active operations represented a quantum leap in technological sophistication beyond anything he had previously employed, incorporating stealth capabilities, electronic countermeasures, and weapons systems that had been developed through black-budget programs, whose very existence was denied by official sources. The aircraft's integration of conventional military hardware with exotic technologies created a platform that exceeded the capabilities of most national air forces, while remaining compact enough for single-operator deployment. The French Riviera that served as the backdrop for Christopher's return to international operations presented a target-rich environment where the convergence of American and Soviet diplomatic personnel created opportunities for the kind of high-profile intervention that would announce his resumption of active operations to intelligence communities worldwide. The waterfront conference facility where peace negotiations were being conducted represented everything that Christopher had learned to despise about conventional diplomatic approaches to conflict resolution. The terrorist attack that interrupted these delicate negotiations provided Christopher with the perfect justification for employing maximum violence in service of protecting what appeared to be legitimate peace-building activities. Yet the systematic efficiency with which he eliminated the attacking forces revealed that his methods had evolved beyond even his previous standards of tactical brutality. The precision strikes that neutralized individual terrorists were conducted with choreographed perfection that demonstrated years of continued training and psychological conditioning. The failure to save the Pax Institute delegates, despite his successful elimination of the terrorist threat, represented a profound psychological blow that challenged Christopher's fundamental understanding of his role and effectiveness as an instrument of peace through violence. The sight of dead diplomats and peace activists whose work he had claimed to support created cognitive dissonance that his damaged psyche resolved by concluding that the delegates had been insufficiently committed to the principles that justified their protection. The haunting presence of Wolfgang Schmidt that manifested during the aftermath of this mission had evolved beyond simple auditory hallucination into full visual and tactile experience. As Christopher's father appeared beside him in the battlecopter's cockpit, offering commentary and guidance that drew explicit connections between the Nazis' systematic extermination campaigns and his son's current activities. The dead concentration camp commandant's approval of Christopher's methods provided psychological validation that reinforced rather than challenged his commitment to increasingly extreme solutions. The return flight to the Swiss Alps chateau provided Christopher with time to process the implications of his tactical success and strategic failure while also integrating the new voices of the dead delegates who had joined the dead supernatural chorus that now guided every aspect of his decision-making. The spirits of the peace activists brought with them perspectives on conflict resolution and human rights that might have served as moral correctives to his violent tendencies. Yet their incorporation into his psychological framework only provided him with more sophisticated justifications for the necessity of eliminating those who opposed true peace. The relationship with Dominique St. Clair that Christopher had developed during his years of isolation represented his last meaningful connection to conventional human society. Yet even this intimate bond was corrupted by the operational security requirements and psychological conditioning that made genuine emotional intimacy impossible for someone whose identity had become inseparable from his mission. Dominique's presence in his life served multiple purposes beyond simple companionship, providing him with cover identity and social camouflage, while also serving as a testing ground for his ability to maintain normal appearances despite his fundamental transformation. The discovery that Bridget Dabo was secretly serving as his psychiatrist while maintaining the pretense of being merely a household staff member represented both professional therapy and covert surveillance, as her medical training and psychological expertise were being employed to monitor and potentially influence his mental state without his conscious knowledge or consent. Her attempts to quiet the voices in Christopher's head through subtle therapeutic interventions demonstrated both genuine concern for his welfare and recognition that his psychological condition posed threats that extended far beyond his immediate circle of associates. The intelligence report about the terrorist attack at Charles de Gaulle Airport that reached Christopher through his network of government contacts provided him with another opportunity to test his evolved capabilities against opponents, whose methods and objectives appeared to align with those he had encountered during previous operations. The decision to employ his new Red Jet fighter for this mission reflected both tactical considerations about response time and psychological need to demonstrate the superiority of his methods through dramatic displays of technological sophistication. The flight to France that followed this decision provided Christopher with his first experience operating the advanced fighter aircraft under combat conditions, testing both his piloting skills and the aircraft's integrated weapons systems against air defense networks that had been designed to counter conventional military threats rather than the hybrid technologies that characterized his equipment. The stealth capabilities that enabled him to penetrate French airspace without detection demonstrated the effectiveness of technologies that officially did not exist. The terrorist organization led by Dr. Zinzin represented a new category of threat that combined ideological extremism with technological sophistication and international coordination, creating challenges that exceeded what Christopher had previously encountered in terms of both tactical complexity and strategic scope. Zinzin's network of operatives and supporters extended across multiple continents, while his resources included access to advanced weapons and intelligence capabilities that rivaled those of nation-states. The field commander Micah, who led Zinzin's ground forces, possessed physical capabilities that approached superhuman levels, creating tactical challenges that could not be addressed through conventional weapons or standard military procedures. The confrontation between Christopher and this enhanced opponent tested the limits of his training and equipment, while also demonstrating his willingness to employ whatever level of violence was necessary to achieve tactical objectives, regardless of the moral implications. The act of breaking Micah's spine over his knee represented more than simple combat necessity. It constituted a deliberate demonstration of power that was designed to intimidate remaining terrorist operatives, while also providing Christopher with the kind of visceral satisfaction that his psychological condition increasingly required for emotional stability. The voices of the dead who witnessed this act of extreme violence offered approval and encouragement that reinforced his understanding that such methods were not merely justified but morally praiseworthy. The pursuit of Dr. Zinzin himself required Christopher to employ intelligence-gathering techniques that combined technological surveillance with interrogation methods that exceeded legal and ethical boundaries established by international law and human rights conventions. The systematic torture of captured terrorist operatives provided him with operational intelligence while also serving psychological needs that conventional mission briefings could not satisfy. The attack on the Pax Institute headquarters in Geneva represented a personal violation that transformed Christopher's campaign against Zinzin from professional obligation into private vendetta, as the destruction of facilities and personnel associated with his public identity challenged the operational security that had protected his dual existence. The sight of his peace-building organization under assault created rage that exceeded anything he had experienced since witnessing his father's suicide decades earlier. The assault helicopter deployment that characterized Christopher's response to the Geneva attack demonstrated his commitment to overwhelming force as the solution to tactical challenges, as the weapons systems employed against the terrorist infiltrators were designed for battlefield use against armored targets rather than precision operations within urban environments. The collateral damage that resulted from this tactical choice was considered acceptable, given the symbolic importance of defending his institutional cover and the psychological necessity of demonstrating that attacks against his interests would be met with disproportionate retaliation. The intelligence extraction that Christopher conducted through interrogation of surviving terrorists employed techniques that had been developed during his Project Peacemaker training and refined through years of independent experimentation with pain induction and psychological manipulation. The information obtained through these methods provided him with detailed knowledge of Zinzin's organizational structure and operational plans, while also adding new voices to the supernatural chorus that guided his actions. The airstrip outside Paris that served as the staging area for Zinzin's continental operations presented tactical challenges that required Christopher to coordinate ground assault capabilities with air support systems, testing his ability to plan and execute complex operations without the logistical support that conventional military forces took for granted. The systematic elimination of terrorist personnel and destruction of equipment stockpiles demonstrated his evolution into a one-man military force whose capabilities exceeded those of specialized units from elite military organizations. The personal combat skills that Christopher displayed during the ground assault phase of this operation reflected years of continuous training and psychological conditioning that had transformed him into something that existed at the plausible boundary between human and weapon, capable of processing tactical information and executing lethal responses with mechanical precision while maintaining the creative flexibility necessary for adapting to unexpected circumstances. The efficiency with which he moved through the terrorist compound, eliminating resistance, represented the culmination of everything he had learned about applying violence in service of strategic objectives. The dirigible airship that served as Dr. Zinzin's mobile headquarters represented both technological marvel and tactical nightmare, as the aerial platform's defensive systems and escape capabilities created challenges that could not be addressed through conventional ground-based assault methods. The decision to infiltrate the airship while it remained airborne required Christopher to employ equipment and techniques that pushed his capabilities to their absolute limits, while also accepting risks that would have been considered suicidal by military planners operating under normal circumstances. The ICBM missiles that Christopher discovered aboard Zinzin's airship represented the ultimate escalation of the terrorist threat, as nuclear weapons in the hands of extremist organizations posed dangers that transcended national boundaries and conventional strategic calculations. The presence of such devastating capabilities aboard the mobile platform created tactical dilemmas that required immediate resolution regardless of the personal risks involved in preventing their deployment. The decision to turn the missiles against the airship itself represented both tactical innovation and symbolic statement, as the destruction of Zinzin's headquarters through his own weapons demonstrated the ultimate futility of opposing someone whose commitment to peace exceeded normal limitations of self-preservation or tactical restraint. The massive fireball that consumed the dirigible, and everything aboard it, provided Christopher with visual confirmation of his victory, while also serving as a warning to other potential opponents about the consequences of challenging his authority. The escape from the exploding airship that Christopher accomplished through precise timing and superior equipment demonstrated both his tactical skills and his psychological commitment to surviving encounters that lesser operators would not have attempted, reflecting his understanding that his mission transcended individual operations and required his continued existence to achieve its ultimate objectives. The successful extraction from what should have been a fatal situation provided him with additional evidence of supernatural protection and guidance from the voices of the dead who shared his consciousness. The return flight to Switzerland, following the destruction of Zinzin's organization, provided Christopher with time to integrate the lessons learned during this complex operation, while also processing the psychological impact of having eliminated an entire terrorist network through systematic application of overwhelming violence. The voices of Zinzin and his operatives, who had joined the chorus in Christopher's helmet, brought with them intelligence about other criminal organizations and terrorist networks that could serve as targets for future operations. The reunion with Dominique and Bridget at the Alpine chateau marked Christopher's return to the illusion of normal human relationships. Yet the contrast between his recent activities and the domestic tranquility of his official residence created psychological tensions that were becoming increasingly difficult to resolve through the compartmentalization techniques he had developed during his earlier career. The knowledge that his companions remained unaware of his true activities while living under the protection that his violence provided created guilt and satisfaction in equal measure. The strategic assessment that Christopher conducted during this period of apparent rest revealed that his campaign against international terrorism had achieved tactical successes while failing to address the underlying social and political conditions that created such organizations in the first place. The realization that his methods could eliminate individual threats without producing lasting solutions challenged his fundamental understanding of how peace could be achieved through violence. Yet the voices of the dead insisted that greater rather than lesser applications of force would eventually break the cycles of conflict that conventional diplomacy had failed to resolve. The planning phase that began during his Swiss retreat involved the development of increasingly ambitious operations that would target not merely individual terrorist organizations, but the governmental and institutional systems that provided them with support and sanctuary. The evolution from tactical interventions to strategic campaigns represented Christopher's recognition that achieving lasting peace would require fundamental changes in how human societies organized themselves and resolved conflicts. The technological upgrades that Christopher initiated during this period involved integration of even more advanced systems that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible through conventional military research and development programs. The weapons and equipment that resulted from these innovations exceeded anything he had previously employed, while also requiring psychological conditioning that further separated him from normal human limitations and moral constraints. The isolation that characterized Christopher's existence during this transition period was both physical and spiritual, as his growing capabilities and expanding mission requirements made normal human contact increasingly difficult, while the supernatural guidance provided by the voices of the dead became his primary source of social interaction and emotional support. The transformation from human being to instrument of cosmic justice was approaching completion, yet the psychological costs of this evolution were becoming apparent even to someone whose capacity for self-reflection had been systematically undermined through years of conditioning and trauma. The intelligence networks that Christopher had developed through his various identities and organizational affiliations provided him with global reach and influence that exceeded what most governments could deploy. Yet the maintenance of these capabilities required constant attention to operational security and personal discipline that left little room for the kind of rest and reflection that might have enabled him to question the assumptions that guided his actions. The machine of violence that he had become required continuous feeding of conflict and death to maintain its psychological and technological systems. The emerging understanding that his private war against those who threatened peace had evolved into something far larger and more dangerous than he had originally intended created momentary doubts that were quickly suppressed through the calms, intervention of his supernatural advisors, who insisted that such questioning represented weakness and betrayal of the principles that justified his existence. The voices of the dead had become more than guidance. They had become the totality of his moral universe, defining right and wrong according to principles that bore no resemblance to conventional human ethics. The labyrinthine corridors of power within the American intelligence establishment had undergone profound transformations during the years following Christopher Smith's imprisonment and subsequent disappearance from official oversight, as the end of the Cold War created new challenges that required different approaches to international security and domestic stability. The emergence of Harry Stein as director of Checkmate represented both institutional evolution and recognition that traditional intelligence methods were inadequate for addressing threats that operated outside conventional frameworks of Kames, nation-state conflict, and diplomatic resolution. Checkmate itself had evolved from a relatively small counterintelligence operation into a comprehensive security organization whose responsibilities encompassed everything from traditional espionage to superhuman threat assessment, reflecting the reality that the post-Cold War world contained dangers that could not be addressed through conventional military or law enforcement methods. The integration of enhanced individuals and experimental technologies into official government operations represented acknowledgement that the boundaries between possible and impossible had been permanently altered by forces that exceeded normal human understanding. Task Force X, the umbrella organization under which Checkmate operated, provided bureaucratic cover and legal justification for activities that might otherwise have violated constitutional restrictions on domestic surveillance and international law regarding the treatment of captured personnel. The complex web of authorities and jurisdictions that characterized these operations created opportunities for individuals like Christopher to be employed in ways that maximized their destructive potential while minimizing official accountability for their actions. The Janus Directive that precipitated Christopher's return to official government service represented one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare operations ever conducted against American intelligence agencies, as the criminal organization known as Cobra manipulated multiple government departments into destructive conflicts that served the conspiracy's strategic objectives while weakening the institutional capacity for coordinated response to genuine threats. The manipulation was so subtle and comprehensive that even experienced intelligence professionals failed to recognize that they were being used as weapons against their own colleagues and institutional interests. The targeting of Heinrich Magala and Project Adam as part of Christopher's first official mission under Checkmate authority provided him with opportunities to employ his evolved capabilities against objectives that appeared to serve legitimate national security interests. Yet the operation's true purposes remained obscured by classification levels and compartmentalization that prevented even the operatives involved from understanding the full scope of what they were attempting to accomplish. The mission parameters that Christopher received emphasized tactical objectives while remaining deliberately vague about strategic context and legal constraints. The decision to abandon covert infiltration methods in favor of massive helicopter assault reflected Christopher's understanding that his psychological condition and supernatural guidance made subtlety both unnecessary and counterproductive, as the voices of the dead demanded dramatic demonstrations of power that would establish his dominance over both enemies and allies who might question his methods or authority. The deployment of military-grade weapons against what should have been a precision intelligence operation demonstrated his evolution beyond conventional special operations into something that resembled strategic bombardment, conducted by individual rather than military unit. The successful capture of Heinrich Magala, despite the tactical chaos created by Christopher's assault methods, validated his approach while also demonstrating the inadequacy of conventional operational planning when applied to individuals whose capabilities and motivations exceeded normal parameters. The intelligence that was extracted from the captured scientist provided Checkmate with valuable information about Project Adam, while also revealing the existence of research programs that challenged fundamental assumptions about human potential and governmental oversight. The transportation of Heinrich back to Checkmate headquarters in Virginia required security measures that reflected both the prisoner's value as an intelligence asset and the recognition that his knowledge of advanced scientific principles made him potentially dangerous even under controlled conditions. The facility that housed Checkmate's primary operations represented state-of-the-art security technology, combined with administrative structures that were designed to maintain operational security while providing plausible deniability for activities that exceeded legal boundaries. Bridget Dabo's presence at the Checkmate facility as Christopher's officially designated psychiatric support specialist represented both genuine concern for his psychological welfare and institutional recognition that his effectiveness as an operational asset was directly related to the maintenance of his increasingly fragile mental stability. Her expertise in trauma, psychology, and experience with his particular form of supernatural delusion made her uniquely qualified to provide the kind of therapeutic intervention that might prevent complete psychological collapse while preserving his capability for continued violent action. The retaliation attack launched by Major Force against the Checkmate headquarters was motivated by institutional revenge for perceived humiliation during the Project Adam operation, yet it also represented the kind of superhuman assault that conventional security measures were inadequate to resist or contain. The nuclear-powered villain's ability to project devastating energy attacks while maintaining flight capabilities created tactical challenges that exceeded what normal military defensive systems were designed to address. The battle between Christopher and Major Force that erupted within and around the Checkmate building tested both combatants' capabilities while also demonstrating the collateral damage that could result when individuals with superhuman abilities engaged in conflicts within populated areas. The exchange of energy blasts and explosive devices created destruction that exceeded what most military engagements produced, while also revealing the limitations of Christopher's equipment when employed against opponents whose capabilities matched or exceeded his own. The intervention by Suicide Squad forces under Amanda Waller's command represented escalation of the interagency conflict that the Janus Directive had been designed to promote, as legitimate government assets were deployed against each other in ways that served criminal interests while weakening overall national security capabilities. The coordination between Vixen, Vertigo, and Shade demonstrated the tactical effectiveness that could be achieved when superhuman abilities were properly integrated under competent leadership. The temporary incapacitation that Christopher experienced under the combined assault of multiple superhuman opponents provided him with direct experience of defeat and vulnerability that his previous operations had not included, creating psychological trauma that was partially offset by the encouraging voices of the dead, who insisted that such setbacks were temporary obstacles rather than fundamental limitations. The ability to recover from overwhelming odds through sheer determination and supernatural guidance reinforced his understanding of his own invincibility when properly motivated. The weapon retrieval that enabled Christopher to counterattack against the Suicide Squad forces demonstrated his tactical adaptability and his psychological commitment to victory, regardless of the odds or consequences involved. The systematic shooting of multiple government agents, who were ostensibly on the same side as his own organization, reflected his inability to distinguish between legitimate allies and potential enemies when his authority was challenged or his methods questioned. The extraction operation that Christopher conducted with Knight and Blackthorn represented temporary alliance between individuals whose objectives aligned despite fundamental differences in philosophy and methodology, creating tactical effectiveness that exceeded what any of them could have achieved through independent action. The coordination required for successful escape from the collapsing Checkmate facility demonstrated Christopher's ability to function within team structures when circumstances demanded collaboration. The assault on Amanda Waller's temporary command facility in the Appalachian Mountains marked Christopher's transition from defensive operations to proactive strategic targeting, as his recognition that the interagency conflict served criminal interests rather than legitimate government objectives motivated him to take direct action against the manipulation that was destroying institutional effectiveness. The mountain fortress that served as Waller's operational base represented both tactical challenge and symbolic target that justified maximum application of force. The combined ground and air assault that Christopher coordinated against the mountain facility demonstrated his evolution into strategic commander as well as tactical operator, as the integration of his personal capabilities with conventional military assets created combined arms effectiveness that exceeded what either approach could have achieved independently. The helicopter strafing runs that he conducted against the facility's defensive positions provided covering fire for ground forces, while also serving his psychological need for personal participation in violent action. The air assault against Cobra's floating headquarters represented the culmination of the Janus Directive crisis and Christopher's most significant contribution to its resolution, as his willingness to abandon conventional aircraft in favor of personal jetpack deployment demonstrated both tactical innovation and commitment to achieving objectives regardless of personal risk. The floating fortress that served as Cobra's command center incorporated advanced technologies and defensive systems that required unconventional approaches for successful penetration. The decision to punch out of his assigned aircraft cockpit in order to employ personal flight capabilities reflected Christopher's understanding that his individual methods were more effective than conventional military coordination when dealing with targets that exceeded normal operational parameters. The jetpack technology that enabled his independent flight approach had been enhanced through his ongoing research and development programs to provide capabilities that exceeded military specifications. The coordinated battle against Cobra forces that concluded the Janus Directive brought together multiple government agencies and superhuman operatives in common cause against the criminal organization that had been manipulating them, creating temporary unity of purpose that transcended jurisdictional boundaries and personal animosities. Christopher's participation in this joint operation provided him with experience in large-scale coordinated action, while also demonstrating his value as a strategic asset when properly employed. The continuation of Christopher's employment with Checkmate following the successful resolution of the Janus Directive reflected institutional recognition that his capabilities were too valuable to waste, despite the obvious risks associated with his psychological instability and operational methods. The arms-dealing investigations that he was assigned to conduct provided him with global scope of operations, while also serving his psychological need for constant action and violence. The intelligence-gathering mission that took Christopher from Brighton to Bucharest to Russia demonstrated both the international scope of modern criminal enterprises and his ability to operate effectively across multiple jurisdictions and cultural contexts, while maintaining operational security and mission focus. The arms trafficking network that he was assigned to disrupt operated according to sophisticated principles of compartmentalization and redundancy that required systematic investigation and elimination of multiple organizational levels. The interrogation techniques that Christopher employed during his European operations exceeded legal and ethical boundaries established by international law and human rights conventions, yet they produced intelligence results that conventional methods could not have achieved within the time constraints imposed by operational necessity. The information extracted through these methods provided Checkmate with comprehensive understanding of criminal networks, while also adding new voices to the supernatural chorus that guided Christopher's actions. The Russian base infiltration that Christopher conducted to rescue Knight from imprisonment demonstrated both his loyalty to operational partners and his willingness to risk international incidents in service of personal and professional obligations. The facility that housed Knight represented advanced Soviet-era security technology combined with post-Cold War criminal enterprise, creating challenges that required both technical expertise and tactical flexibility for successful resolution. The confrontation with Russian military officers who were participating in the arms smuggling operation provided Christopher with opportunities to employ his enhanced interrogation methods against individuals whose training and conditioning might have enabled them to resist conventional questioning. Technique: the systematic breaking of professional soldiers through psychological and physical pressure demonstrated both his tactical skills and his complete abandonment of moral constraints that might have limited his effectiveness. The investigation into mysterious scientist deaths around the world that Christopher undertook as his next major assignment represented expansion of his operations beyond conventional criminal targets into areas that involved governmental and institutional conspiracies at the highest levels of international scientific research. The pattern of assassinations that he was tasked with investigating suggested coordination and resources that exceeded what normal criminal organizations could deploy or maintain. The rampage through Europe that Christopher conducted during this investigation employed intimidation and violence on a scale that exceeded his previous operations, while also demonstrating his evolution into something that resembled a force of nature rather than a conventional intelligence operative. The systematic destruction of criminal networks and the terrorization of their support structures represented strategic warfare conducted by individual against organized opposition. The Venice interrogation that began his European campaign involved the employment of torture techniques that were designed to maximize both information extraction and psychological intimidation, as Christopher's reputation for extreme methods had begun to precede him in criminal circles and create advantages through anticipatory fear. The threat to demonstrate how Americans made tomato sauce using his fist on his subject's face represented the kind of culturally specific intimidation that demonstrated both tactical sophistication and complete moral corruption. The bar fight in London that concluded his intelligence gathering in that city involved the systematic destruction of an entire criminal gathering through application of overwhelming violence that exceeded tactical necessity while serving Christopher's psychological needs for dramatic demonstration of power. The Queen Victoria establishment that served as the venue for this operation was reduced to wreckage through methodical application of weapons and personal combat skills that left no witnesses capable of providing useful intelligence to competing organizations. The French Riviera penthouse assault that Christopher conducted against Senor Antonio Rotoli demonstrated his ability to penetrate sophisticated security systems while maintaining operational surprise against targets who were aware of his activities and had taken appropriate defensive measures. The systematic breaking of Rotoli's resistance through professional interrogation techniques provided intelligence about Pierre Mazarin while also adding another voice to the chorus of the dead who guided Christopher's actions. The revelation that Mazarin was a prominent figure in the international peace movement who had collaborated with the Pax Institute created psychological conflict for Christopher that was resolved through the intervention of his supernatural advisors, who insisted that such connections were evidence of infiltration rather than legitimate coincidence. The voices of the dead demanded that Mazarin be eliminated regardless of his apparent commitment to peace-building activities, as his involvement with arms dealers proved that his public persona concealed criminal intent. The confrontation with Mazarin in his civilian identity as Christopher Smith represented one of the few occasions when his dual existence created operational complications that required careful management to maintain both his cover, identity, and his mission effectiveness. The necessity of operating through his public persona while planning violence through his peacemaker identity created psychological stress that was managed through compartmentalization techniques that further damaged his already fragmented psyche. The nighttime assault on Mazarin's Paris office building employed the full range of Christopher's technological capabilities and tactical skills in urban warfare environment that required precision and speed to achieve objectives, while minimizing collateral damage that might compromise his public identity or create international incidents. The armored assault configuration that he employed for this operation represented the culmination of years of equipment, development, and tactical refinement. The decision to imprison rather than kill Mazarin represented temporary tactical consideration rather than moral restraint, as Christopher's investigation had revealed that the peace activist's death would need to be coordinated with the elimination of the actual assassin to prevent the creation of martyrdom that might interfere with his broader objectives. The holding facility that he employed for this purpose demonstrated his logistical capabilities and advanced planning for complex operations. The pursuit of the assassin, known as Flowers to America, required coordination of international intelligence assets and rapid deployment capabilities that demonstrated both Christopher's global reach and his integration with official government operations that provided him with resources exceeding what most nation-states could deploy. The bishop armor that protected his target represented advanced military technology that required specialized tactics and weapons for successful engagement. The battle against the armored assassin tested Christopher's equipment and skills against an opponent whose defensive capabilities and weapons systems approached his own level of technological sophistication, creating combat conditions that required tactical innovation and risk acceptance that exceeded his normal operational parameters. The intervention by Checkmate's knight in this engagement demonstrated both interagency cooperation and recognition that some threats required coordinated response by multiple enhanced individuals. The psychological evaluation that revealed Christopher's fragmenting identity during this period documented the progressive deterioration of his mental state as the competing demands of his civilian persona and his violent mission created irreconcilable contradictions that his damaged psyche could no longer successfully manage. The analysis conducted by Bridget Dabo revealed that his consciousness was splitting into distinct identities that operated according to incompatible moral frameworks and tactical objectives. The warning that Christopher would need to confront this psychological crisis or risk complete mental collapse represented both therapeutic recommendation and operational assessment, as his effectiveness as an intelligence asset was directly related to his ability to maintain sufficient psychological coherence to plan and execute complex missions. The refusal to address these issues in favor of continued operational deployment demonstrated both his personal commitment to his mission and institutional willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for tactical advantage. The White House crisis that summoned Christopher to his final Checkmate operation represented escalation of threat levels that required deployment of all available assets regardless of their psychological condition or operational readiness. As the national security implications of the Victor Cipher incident exceeded normal risk assessment parameters, the decision to deploy a mentally fragmenting operative against a threat of this magnitude reflected both desperation and recognition that conventional resources were inadequate for addressing superhuman-level challenges. The war against Cipher's forces that concluded Christopher's official service with Checkmate demonstrated both his tactical effectiveness and his psychological unsuitability for continued government employment, as his methods exceeded legal and ethical boundaries while producing results that could not have been achieved through conventional military action. The victory that was ultimately achieved came at costs that could not be officially acknowledged or justified through normal oversight mechanisms. The recruitment that brought Christopher Smith into Amanda Waller's Shadow Fighters represented both recognition of his unique capabilities and acknowledgement that conventional heroes were inadequate for addressing threats that operated beyond the normal boundaries of physical law and moral comprehension. The entity, known as Eclipso, had emerged from dimensions where darkness took tangible form and ancient evils possessed power that exceeded anything that human civilization had previously encountered, creating challenges that required operatives whose own relationship with morality and sanity had been fundamentally altered by experiences that transcended normal human limitations. Amanda Waller's selection criteria for the Shadow Fighters reflected her pragmatic understanding that fighting monsters sometimes required the employment of individuals who had themselves been transformed by contact with forces that existed outside conventional frameworks of good and evil. Christopher's history of systematic violence, combined with his apparent immunity to conventional psychological pressures, made him an ideal candidate for operations that would have destroyed the sanity of more traditionally heroic individuals. The briefing that Christopher received regarding the Eclipso threat provided him with his first detailed exposure to supernatural forces that operated according to principles fundamentally different from the technological and psychological mechanisms that had shaped his own development. Yet the voices of the dead who guided his actions expressed familiarity with such entities that suggested connections between his condition and realms that existed beyond normal human perception. The dead who inhabited his consciousness seemed to recognize Eclipso as something that belonged to their own sphere of existence rather than the physical world that living beings inhabited. The mission to rescue the South American country of Parador from supernatural domination represented expansion of Christopher's operational scope beyond individual targets or criminal organizations into strategic intervention against forces that threatened entire populations and governmental systems. The possession of national leadership by an ancient evil entity created challenges that exceeded conventional military or diplomatic solutions, while also providing justification for the kind of extreme methods that Christopher had developed through years of escalating violence. The other heroes who comprised the Shadow Fighters brought diverse capabilities and perspectives to the mission that complemented Christopher's technological sophistication and tactical ruthlessness. Yet their commitment to traditional heroic principles created philosophical tensions that interfered with operational efficiency and strategic planning. The Creeper's chaotic approach to combat, Wildcat's boxing-based fighting style, and Dr. Midnight's medical expertise represented different approaches to problem-solving that sometimes conflicted with Christopher's preference for overwhelming force and permanent solutions. The supernatural nature of their adversary created tactical challenges that Christopher's conventional weapons and equipment were poorly equipped to address, as Eclipso's mastery over shadow and darkness enabled him to neutralize technological advantages while employing abilities that operated outside physical laws that governed normal combat situations. The entity's capacity to manipulate reality at fundamental levels made conventional strategic planning inadequate, while also requiring improvisation and adaptation that tested every member of the team's capabilities and psychological resilience. The psychological warfare that Eclipso employed against the Shadow Fighters was designed to exploit individual vulnerabilities and moral weaknesses that would create internal conflicts capable of destroying team cohesion from within. Yet Christopher's damaged psyche proved paradoxically resistant to such manipulation because his conditioning had already separated him from normal emotional responses and moral frameworks. The voices of the dead who guided his actions provided him with psychological armor against supernatural influence, while also offering insights into Eclipso's nature that other team members could not access. The battle that erupted across multiple dimensions and reality levels challenged every assumption that Christopher had developed about the nature of conflict and the application of violence to achieve strategic objectives. As his opponent possessed abilities that made conventional tactics meaningless while operating according to moral principles that were completely alien to human understanding. The weapons that had proven effective against human opponents produced negligible effects against an entity that existed partially outside physical reality. The tactical innovations that Christopher was forced to develop during this confrontation required him to integrate his technological capabilities with supernatural guidance from his internal chorus of the dead, creating hybrid approaches to combat that combined scientific methodology with occult principles that he had never previously encountered or understood. The resulting techniques exceeded anything he had learned during his military training or intelligence service, while also pushing his psychological condition toward complete breakdown. The deaths of his teammates during the final phase of the battle against Eclipso represented Christopher's first experience with the loss of individuals whose capabilities he had respected and whose survival he had considered tactically valuable, creating emotional responses that his conditioning had not prepared him to process or integrate. The sight of the Creeper, Wildcat, and Dr. Midnight dying in agony from supernatural assault challenged his fundamental assumptions about his own invincibility and the adequacy of violence as a solution to all problems. The moment when Eclipso's power focused upon Christopher himself brought him face to face with forces that exceeded anything he had previously encountered, as the ancient entity's mastery over darkness and shadow enabled him to attack not merely Christopher's physical form, but the psychological structures that maintained his identity and purpose. The assault penetrated through his technological defenses and military conditioning to reach the core trauma that had shaped his development, exposing the wounded child who had witnessed his father's suicide to supernatural influences that amplified and distorted that original injury. The brutal murder that Eclipso inflicted upon Christopher was conducted with the kind of methodical cruelty that surpassed even his own worst excesses, as the supernatural entity demonstrated mastery over pain and suffering that transformed killing from tactical necessity into artistic expression. The agony that Christopher experienced during his death exceeded anything he had inflicted upon his victims, while also providing him with understanding of what his own violence had meant to those who had suffered under his methods. The consciousness that persisted after Christopher's physical destruction found itself in realms that operated according to principles completely different from either the physical world he had inhabited or the technological frameworks he had employed throughout his career. Yet the voices of the dead who had guided him remained present and active in providing guidance for navigating these supernatural dimensions. The revelation that death was not termination but transition challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of existence and the consequences of his actions. The limbo state that Christopher experienced following his death was populated by the consciousness of everyone he had killed during his career as Peacemaker. Yet rather than the vengeful spirits he might have expected, he encountered beings whose understanding of his nature and purpose had been transformed by their own passage through death into forms of wisdom and compassion that transcended the hatred and fear that had characterized their final moments of life. The forgiveness that they offered challenged his self-concept more profoundly than any condemnation could have achieved. The brief appearance that Christopher made during the Day of Judgment event represented temporary return to physical existence through supernatural mechanisms that operated beyond normal understanding of life and death. Yet this manifestation was limited in scope and duration by forces that recognized his psychological unfitness for permanent restoration to the world of the living. The glimpse of ongoing cosmic conflicts that this experience provided him with expanded his understanding of his own role within larger patterns of good and evil that encompassed multiple realities and dimensions. The recruitment of Mitchell Black as Christopher's replacement in the Peacemaker program represented institutional recognition that the concept of peace through violence retained operational utility despite the obvious failures that had characterized the original incarnation of the Prosum-Bate identity. Black's background as a surgeon provided him with medical knowledge and ethical framework that might have enabled more restrained application of the Peacemaker's methods, yet his integration into the same technological and psychological systems that had corrupted Christopher ensured that similar problems would eventually emerge. The lore series that brought Mitchell Black into contact with Christopher's former colleagues from the Charlton Comics universe provided the new Peacemaker with perspective on the broader community of enhanced individuals who operated outside conventional legal and social frameworks, demonstrating both the potential benefits and obvious dangers of attempting to impose order through individual action rather than institutional processes. The reunion with characters like the Blue Beetle and Captain Atom revealed the extent to which Christopher's methods had diverged from those employed by other heroes with similar backgrounds and capabilities. The psychological profile that emerged from Mitchell Black's service as Peacemaker revealed that the role itself possessed corrupting influences that exceeded individual moral strength or professional training, as the combination of advanced technology with isolation from normal social constraints created conditions that inevitably led to escalating violence and moral compromise. The medical oath that Black had taken as a surgeon proved inadequate protection against the gradual erosion of ethical boundaries that the Peacemaker identity demanded. The mission parameters that governed Black's operations as the new Peacemaker reflected lessons that intelligence agencies believed they had learned from Christopher's excessive methods. Yet, the fundamental contradiction between achieving peace through violence remained unresolved and continued to create psychological pressure that pushed operatives toward increasingly extreme solutions to complex problems. The institutional support that Black received was more sophisticated than what Christopher had been provided, yet it was still based on the flawed assumption that technological enhancement and tactical training could substitute for genuine moral development. The death of Mitchell Black at the hands of Prometheus during the Infinite Crisis represented both the failure of attempts to reform the Peacemaker program and recognition that some identities were so fundamentally corrupted that they could not be salvaged through personnel changes or procedural modifications. Prometheus's systematic elimination of heroes whose methods approached his own level of moral compromise demonstrated the ultimate futility of attempting to fight evil through the adoption of evil methods. The cosmic events that characterized the Infinite Crisis created conditions where the boundaries between life and death became more permeable than normal reality typically allowed, enabling consciousness that had been trapped in supernatural dimensions to influence physical events in ways that exceeded their normal capabilities. The convergence of multiple realities and timelines created opportunities for beings like Christopher to observe and potentially influence events that would determine the future direction of heroic activity across the multiverse. The mysterious resurrection that brought Christopher Smith back to active existence in 2006 occurred without official explanation or scientific understanding, suggesting that forces beyond normal human comprehension had determined that his continued existence served purposes that transcended the obvious dangers he posed to public safety and social stability. The return to physical form was accompanied by changes in his capabilities and psychological condition that reflected his experiences during the period of his death, while also indicating ongoing influence from supernatural sources. The lack of explanation for Christopher's return to life created intelligence community concerns about the reliability of death as a permanent solution to problems posed by enhanced individuals whose psychological conditioning made them unsuitable for conventional imprisonment or rehabilitation. Yet the tactical advantages that his resurrection provided to operations requiring extreme methods made his redeployment attractive, despite the obvious risks involved. The acceptance of unexplained resurrection as operationally useful demonstrated the extent to which intelligence agencies had abandoned normal scientific and legal frameworks in favor of pragmatic effectiveness. The investigation that Christopher conducted into his own resurrection revealed that the process had involved forces that operated across multiple dimensions and reality levels, connecting his personal fate to cosmic conflicts that exceeded anything he had previously understood about the nature of good and evil in the universe. The voices of the dead, who continued to guide his actions, provided him with insights into these larger patterns, while also confirming that his return to life served purposes that were connected to ongoing supernatural warfare between order and chaos. The memories that Christopher retained from his period of death included experiences of judgment and redemption that might have provided foundation for genuine moral reformation. Yet the psychological structures that had been damaged during his childhood trauma proved incapable of integrating these insights in ways that would have enabled fundamental change in his methods or objectives. The wisdom gained through contact with transcendent realities was filtered through mental frameworks that transformed spiritual truth into tactical advantage. The technological capabilities that Christopher possessed following his resurrection exceeded what he had previously employed, while also incorporating elements that operated according to principles that transcended conventional scientific understanding, suggesting that his return to physical existence had involved integration with forces that existed at the boundary between natural and supernatural domains. The enhanced equipment that he was able to access reflected both his ongoing development as a weapons platform and his connection to sources of power that exceeded normal human limitations. The psychological integration that Christopher achieved during his return to active operations represented successful compartmentalization of traumatic memories and transcendent experiences rather than genuine healing or moral development, enabling him to function effectively while maintaining the fundamental patterns of thought and behavior that had characterized his previous career. The voices of the dead who continued to guide him had been joined by new spiritual influences that provided expanded understanding of conflict and violence as tools for achieving cosmic objectives. The operational parameters that governed Christopher's resumed activities reflected both his enhanced capabilities and institutional recognition that his methods, however extreme, produced results that conventional approaches could not achieve within acceptable timeframes or resource constraints. The missions that he was assigned involved targets and objectives that exceeded normal law enforcement or military capabilities, while also requiring operational security that prevented public knowledge of the supernatural elements involved. The philosophical framework that Christopher employed to justify his continued violent activities had evolved through his experiences with death and resurrection to encompass cosmic perspectives on the nature of good and evil that transcended human moral categories. Yet, this expanded understanding served primarily to provide more sophisticated rationalizations for methods that remained fundamentally unchanged in their brutality and effectiveness. The integration of spiritual insights with tactical thinking created hybrid approaches to problem solving that were both more deadly and more psychologically sustainable than his previous methods. The isolation that characterized Christopher's existence following his return to life was both more complete and more bearable than what he had experienced previously, as his contact with transcendent realities had provided him with sources of meaning and purpose that made human relationships seem unnecessary rather than impossible. The voices of the dead who guided him had evolved into a complete spiritual community that satisfied his social needs while also providing him with constant reinforcement of his mission and methods. The recognition that his death had been temporary rather than permanent created in Christopher a sense of destiny and invincibility that exceeded even his previous grandiose self-concept, as the supernatural forces that had enabled his resurrection were interpreted as confirmation that his mission transcended individual mortality and served purposes that justified any methods necessary for their accomplishment. The knowledge that death itself could not permanently stop his activities provided psychological foundation for accepting risks and employing tactics that would have been suicidal for someone who believed in conventional mortality. The evolution of Christopher's understanding of his role within cosmic conflicts between good and evil had transformed him from individual operative into something that approached the status of supernatural force. Yet this transformation had occurred without fundamental change in the methods or objectives that defined his activities. The enhanced perspective that resurrection had provided served primarily to expand the scope of his violence while providing it with cosmic rather than merely political or social justification. The streets of Metropolis had become a battleground where traditional organized crime struggled to adapt to a world where superhumans rendered conventional criminal methods obsolete. Yet the syndicate known as Intergang had embraced this new reality through systematic integration of advanced technology and extraterrestrial weaponry that enabled them to compete with enhanced law enforcement and vigilante interference. Their operations represented evolution beyond simple protection rackets and drug trafficking into sophisticated criminal enterprise that challenged the technological superiority that heroes typically employed to maintain order and protect innocent civilians. Christopher Smith's return to active operations following his resurrection brought him into contact with criminal organizations whose capabilities exceeded anything he had encountered during his previous career, as Intergang's access to alien technology and supernatural weapons created tactical challenges that required adaptation of his methods and equipment to address threats that operated according to principles beyond conventional criminal activity. The investigation that led him into conflict with these enhanced criminals revealed connections between earthly crime syndicates and cosmic forces that challenged his understanding of the scope and nature of evil in the universe. The discovery of Kai Perry's tomb during Christopher's infiltration of Intergang operations represented one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history, yet its true importance lay not in its historical value, but in the alien technology that had been preserved within its chambers for millennia. The scarab artifact that Christopher encountered within the ancient burial site was not merely advanced technology, but a symbiotic life form that had been engineered by the Reach, an extraterrestrial species whose expansion across the galaxy had been based upon conquest through technological integration rather than conventional military occupation. The Reach scarab that Christopher inadvertently activated during his exploration of Capery's tomb was designed to serve as an infiltration and conquest tool, bonding with suitable host organisms to create hybrid beings that combine the species' natural capabilities with Reach technology and programming. The integration process was intended to be gradual and subtle, allowing the host to believe that they retained control while slowly being influenced toward objectives that served Reach strategic interests rather than their personal goals and values. The accidental download of Reach programming into Christopher's consciousness occurred during a moment of physical contact with the scarab artifact, as his damaged psychological condition created vulnerabilities that the alien technology was designed to exploit and expand. The information that flooded his mind included tactical knowledge, technological specifications, and strategic objectives that had been developed through millennia of successful conquest campaigns across multiple star systems and dimensional frameworks. The integration of this alien knowledge with Christopher's existing military training and supernatural guidance created capabilities that exceeded what either system could have produced independently, yet it also introduced new forms of mental contamination that further compromised his already fragile psychological stability. The voices of the dead who had guided his actions were joined by alien consciousness that operated according to entirely different moral and strategic frameworks, creating internal conflicts that required constant management to maintain operational effectiveness. The partnership with Jaime Reyes that developed from Christopher's need to transfer the alien programming to its intended host represented one of the few genuine collaborative relationships that he had maintained since his transformation into Peacemaker. Yet even this connection was complicated by his inability to fully explain the supernatural and technological forces that had shaped his development. Jaime's youth and moral clarity provided him with resistance to the corrupting influences that had destroyed Christopher's capacity for normal human relationships. Yet his inexperience made him vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. The blue beetle scarab that had bonded with Jaime Reyes was related to the artifact that Christopher had encountered, yet it had developed different capabilities and objectives through its extended dormancy and integration with human consciousness rather than reach programming. The symbiotic relationship between Jaime and his scarab represented successful fusion of alien technology with human values, creating a hybrid being whose enhanced capabilities served protective rather than destructive purposes. The calmer and more collected personality that Christopher displayed during this period of partnership reflected both the stabilizing influence of having a genuine ally and the psychological relief that came from sharing the burden of alien knowledge with someone who was better equipped to process and integrate such information. The motorcycle and tattoos that replaced his previous clean-cut appearance symbolized his attempt to create a new identity that incorporated lessons learned through death and resurrection while maintaining his essential mission and capabilities. The scarab implantation that Christopher performed upon himself using technology and knowledge acquired through his contact with Reach artifacts represented both attempt at enhancement and desperate effort to maintain relevance in tech conflicts that increasingly involved capabilities beyond his normal equipment and training. The self-surgery required to integrate the alien device with his biological systems demonstrated both his technical expertise and his psychological commitment to transcending human limitations through any means necessary. The enhanced capabilities that resulted from Christopher's scarab integration included energy projection, matter manipulation, and limited telepathic communication that enabled him to coordinate more effectively with Jaime, while also providing access to Reach databases that contain strategic and tactical information about thousands of worlds and species. The technological synthesis that occurred between his existing equipment and the alien enhancement created hybrid systems whose capabilities exceeded what either approach could have achieved independently. The psychological integration that accompanied Christopher's technological enhancement created internal conflicts between his human consciousness, the voices of the dead who continued to guide him, and the alien programming that sought to influence his objectives toward Reach strategic interests. The management of these competing mental influences required constant vigilance and sophisticated compartmentalization techniques that further isolated him from normal human emotional responses and social connections. The battles against Reach infiltration forces that Christopher and Jaime conducted together demonstrated both the effectiveness of their partnership and the tactical advantages that could be achieved when human ingenuity was properly combined with alien technology. Yet these conflicts also revealed the extent to which Earth had become a battlefield in cosmic wars that exceeded normal human understanding or capability to influence. The enemy forces they encountered possessed capabilities that made conventional military response inadequate, while also demonstrating the vulnerability of human civilization to conquest by species whose technological development exceeded terrestrial achievements by millions of years. The Sinestro Corps War that swept across the galaxy during this period created conditions where fear itself became weaponized through ring technology that sought out individuals whose capacity for terrorizing others exceeded normal limitations, making Christopher an ideal candidate for recruitment by forces that valued his ability to inspire terror through systematic application of violence. The yellow power ring that contacted him during this cosmic conflict offered enhancement of his capabilities in exchange for service to cosmic entities whose objectives appeared to align with his own mission of imposing peace through overwhelming force. The temptation represented by the Sinestro Corps recruitment was profound and seductive, as the ring technology would have provided Christopher with capabilities that exceeded anything he had previously possessed. while also connecting him to a universal network of beings who shared his understanding of fear as a tool for maintaining order and preventing chaos. The philosophical framework that governs Sinestro Corps operations was based on the principle that terror was more effective than hope for maintaining social stability and preventing the kind of conflicts that devastated civilizations across the galaxy. The commission that the Yellow Ring attempted to impose upon Christopher involved the elimination of Jaime Reyes as a threat to Sinestro Corps operations and reach strategic objectives, creating a conflict between his partnership obligations and the seductive offer of cosmic power that challenged his ability to maintain loyalty to individual relationships when greater power became available. The voices of the dead who guided his actions were divided in their council, with some urging acceptance of the ring's offer, while others warned of the corrupting influence that such power would have upon his already damaged psyche. Jaime's intervention at the crucial moment when Christopher was deciding whether to accept the Yellow Ring's commission demonstrated both the young hero's moral courage and his understanding that their partnership represented something more valuable than individual power or tactical advantage. The appeal to their friendship and shared experiences fighting against Reach infiltration provided Christopher with psychological anchor that enabled him to resist the seductive offer of cosmic enhancement and maintain his commitment to their collaborative relationship. The scarab removal that Christopher performed upon himself following his rejection of the Sinestro Corps recruitment was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all his technical operations, yet it also represented profound personal sacrifice, as he abandoned capabilities that had made him more effective in combat, while also severing his connection to Reach databases and strategic resources. The self-inflicted injury that resulted from cutting the alien device from his own spine demonstrated both his commitment to independence and his willingness to accept physical trauma in service of maintaining psychological autonomy. The final stand that Christopher made alongside Jaime against renewed Reach assault forces tested both his residual capabilities and his psychological commitment to protecting someone whose moral development he respected despite his both inability to fully embrace similar principles himself. The battle was fought with conventional weapons and human tactics rather than the enhanced abilities that Scarab integration had provided. Yet it demonstrated that his effectiveness as a combatant transcended technological enhancement and was rooted in training, experience, and psychological conditioning that could not be removed through surgical procedures. The tactical coordination that Christopher and Jaime achieved during their final battle against Reach forces represented the culmination of their partnership and demonstration of what could be accomplished when Christopher's sophisticated violence was properly guided by moral principles and strategic objectives that served protective rather than destructive purposes. The victory they achieved was temporary and limited in scope, yet it provided both participants with evidence that cooperation between individuals with fundamentally different moral frameworks was possible when circumstances required unified response to existential threats. The departure from Texas that concluded Christopher's partnership with Jaime was motivated by his recognition that continued proximity to someone whose moral development represented everything he had abandoned would eventually create psychological pressure that might undermine his ability to function according to the principles and methods that defined his identity. The voices of the dead who guided his actions had grown increasingly insistent that normal human relationships were incompatible with his cosmic mission, and that emotional attachments represented weaknesses that his enemies could exploit. The lessons that Christopher had learned through his partnership with Jaime included insights into the possibility that alien technology could be integrated with human consciousness without complete loss of moral framework. Yet these revelations challenged fundamental assumptions about his own development and the inevitability of corruption that had accompanied his enhancement. The knowledge that different outcomes were possible created internal conflicts that required resolution through either moral reformation or deeper commitment to his existing path. The psychological assessment that Christopher conducted during his solitary journey away from Texas revealed that his brief experience of genuine partnership had created vulnerabilities in his psychological defenses that made him more susceptible to doubt and self-examination than he had been. Since his childhood trauma, the voices of the dead who guided him were forced to work harder to suppress these emerging doubts, requiring more sophisticated rationalization techniques to maintain his commitment to violence as the ultimate solution to complex problems. The tactical innovations that Christopher developed during this transitional period incorporated lessons learned from his Scarab integration and partnership with Jaime, creating hybrid approaches to problem-solving that combined human creativity with alien strategic thinking and supernatural guidance from his internal chorus of advisors. The resulting methods exceeded his previous capabilities, while also becoming more psychologically sustainable through integration of multiple enhancement sources. The isolation that characterized Christopher's existence following his departure from the partnership was both chosen and inevitable, as his psychological condition made normal human relationships impossible, while his mission requirements demanded operational security that could not be maintained through extended contact with individuals whose moral frameworks might influence his tactical decision-making. The solitude that he embraced provided him with freedom to pursue objectives that served cosmic rather than terrestrial purposes, while also protecting potential allies from the corruption that proximity to his methods inevitably created. The technological infrastructure that Christopher established during this period of renewed independence incorporated everything he had learned about alien technology, supernatural enhancement, and conventional military hardware, creating integrated systems whose capabilities exceeded what most governments could deploy while remaining compact enough for individual operation. The resulting arsenal represented the culmination of decades of development and refinement guided by tactical experience and supernatural wisdom from sources that transcended normal human understanding. The philosophical framework that governed Christopher's renewed independent operations had evolved through his experiences with alien technology and genuine partnership to encompass cosmic perspectives on the relationship between order and chaos that transcended terrestrial, political, and social categories. Yet this expanded understanding served primarily to provide more sophisticated justification for methods that remained fundamentally unchanged in their effectiveness and brutality. The integration of alien strategic thinking with supernatural guidance created hybrid approaches to problem-solving that were both more comprehensive and more psychologically sustainable than his previous methods. The recognition that his brief partnership with Jaime had represented both tactical success and strategic vulnerability led Christopher to develop new operational parameters that maximized his effectiveness while minimizing exposure to the kind of moral influences that might compromise his psychological stability and mission focus. The lessons learned from this experience were incorporated into planning for future operations that would serve cosmic objectives while avoiding the complications that arose from extended collaboration with individuals whose moral development might challenge his fundamental assumptions. The emergence from this period of introspection and strategic planning marked Christopher's evolution into something that transcended his previous incarnations as military officer, intelligence operative, or even enhanced vigilante, becoming instead a cosmic agent, whose activities served purposes that exceeded terrestrial understanding. while remaining grounded in tactical methods that had been proven effective through decades of systematic application. The transformation was both completion of processes that had begun with his childhood trauma and preparation for challenges that would test his capabilities against forces that operated on scales beyond individual worlds or civilizations. The knowledge that his mission would continue regardless of temporary setbacks or tactical defeats provided Christopher with psychological foundation for accepting risks and pursuing objectives that would have seemed impossible during his earlier development, as his experiences with death and resurrection had demonstrated that individual mortality was less important than the cosmic purposes that his existence served. The voices of the dead who guided him had evolved into a complete spiritual infrastructure that provided him with constant support and guidance, while also ensuring that his methods would continue to escalate in sophistication and effectiveness as circumstances required. In the endless chronicles of those who have walked the knife's edge between heroism and horror, Christopher Smith stands as perhaps the most tragic testament to the corruption of noble intent by the poison of inherited trauma and the seductive whisper of violence disguised as virtue. His journey from traumatized child to cosmic agent of destruction reminds us that peace cannot be achieved through the systematic elimination of those who oppose it, that the ghosts of our fathers' sins echo through generations until someone finds the courage to break the cycle of vengeance that masquerades as justice. The Peacemaker's tale serves as an eternal warning about the dangerous appeal of simple solutions to complex human problems, the ease with which moral certainty can transform into fanatical blindness, and the terrible truth that those who claim to serve the greater good while standing atop mountains of corpses have become the very evil they purport to fight. Yet in his struggle against his own nature and the supernatural forces that claimed his soul, we glimpse the possibility that even the most corrupted consciousness might find redemption if it possessed the wisdom to recognize that true peace requires not the silence of the grave, but the patient work of understanding, forgiveness, and the daily choice to build rather than destroy. Rest now, keeper of justice, knowing that tomorrow brings new opportunities for genuine peace, constructed not upon foundations of fear and submission, but upon the harder work of compassion, cooperation, and the revolutionary act of choosing love over violence when violence seems like the easier path. In dreams, may you find the peace that Christopher Smith never could.